As Jedi Padawan Obi-Wan Kenobi stepped out of the sleek Nubian cruiser, he shielded his eyes from the blinding suns, wincing as a sharp intake of breath filled his lungs with searing hot air, and the young man could only think of one thing. I'm never going to set foot in sand again. The day had already been long enough without the misery of Tatooine to look forward to, but it seemed like the Force had an especially cruel sense of humor the past few days. Or weeks. Or heck, as far back as Kenobi could remember. The man sighed as he squinted against the light, gazing across the vast desert of any sign of the trading city that was supposedly nearby, but he could see nothing but sand and sand dunes and more sand. What an idiotic mess, he said under his breath as he flicked his Padawan braid over his right shoulder. It could certainly be worse. Obi-Wan spun around quickly to face the deep voice emerging from the ship behind him. His master, Qui-Gon, came to stand beside his young apprentice, his heavy Jedi robes changed in favor of a much lighter tunic to make traveling in this heat more bearable. It was, after all, your decision to land here. I didn't want this, Master, but this planet was most convenient. Nothing else made sense, given our circumstances. Kenobi grit his teeth, absently twirling his braid around his finger. I just want to get back home as quickly as possible so this mission can be over with. Qui-Gon laid a heavy hand on the youth's shoulder. As do I, Obi-Wan. Don't worry. We'll come back as quickly as possible. For the record, Master, I find the current plan lacking. Obi-Wan indicated to the ship behind them, reflecting the blazing suns like a mirror. This is a top-of-the-line, custom ship that the Trade Federation is almost certainly tracing. Getting the parts we need on a backwater planet like this is unlikely at best. Still, we must try, young one. Or we could just sell the ship and buy a smaller ship that can't be traced. Master, the parts we need are extremely costly, we'd be better off getting a new ship. I doubt the Queen would agree. What she wants doesn't matter. Sweat dripped down his face, and it was only then that Kenobi realized that he was shouting, his heart beating strong and fast in his chest, his temperature rising quickly with his temper. He took a deep breath of the scorching air in an attempt to calm himself, but the blazing heat only served to irritate him further. Master, he said softly, his voice straining with control. Our priority is her safety. A new ship is safer, and it would return us to Coruscant more quickly. She can get a new pointlessly extravagant ship there, if she desires. If she has the money for a new outfit for every hour, she can certainly afford a new ship. Qui-Gon chuckled softly, smiling gently at his young Padawan. You're probably right, and it may come to that. Let me first at least see what is available in Mos Espa, and we'll decide what to do from there. He watched the young man take a deep breath and hold it, his jaw clenched tightly. Obi-Wan. Be mindful of your impatience. The Force has brought us here for a reason. It will reveal itself in time. Yes, I try, Master. I am trying. I know you are. But don't you think this is vexing? Qui-Gon gave his Padawan a stern look, but the edges of his mouth turned up into a good-natured smirk. I'll admit, this mission could have gone smoother, yes. Some of the trouble is your fault, Master, Kenobi said lightly, his blue eyes glinting with laughter, the tension and frustration giving way to the absurdity of it all. It wasn't that bad, was it? Isn't it always? I seem to attract it. The Jedi Master smiled at his student as the boy slowly relaxed into an easy laugh like he so often did. Obi-Wan was a gifted student, intelligent, methodical, and remarkably strong in the Force, and the boy knew it, which was a part of the problem. The boy had struggled with arrogance and ill temper in the past, but had come a long way from the rash child he was back in their early missions on Mandalore. His arrogance had honed itself into a sharp wit, and as he grew older, he became more humble. However, his edge had yet to be lost, and frustration often overwhelmed him when he believed he knew best, and others just didn't see it. It was in this way that Obi-Wan and his master began clashing, loudly and often as the boy became older and closer to becoming ready to undergo the trials. Qui-Gon often bucked against the Jedi Council, which Obi-Wan had no ability to understand. Qui-Gon was firmly rooted in the living Force, which made his actions seem random and pointless to the bigger picture that Obi-Wan often focused on, a strict adherence to the Jedi Code, guiding the Padawan's actions that made him wary of his master's apparent disregard for the code. Despite this, the two were close, and Qui-Gon suspected that it was the boy's complete trust and comfort with his master that made him speak his mind so freely. The Jedi Master watched his Padawan's smiling face slowly drop away into one of disgust as the ship's hatch hissed open and the loud, shrill, accented comment of their Gungan companion rang out over the empty space of the desert. Obi-Wan. I can't believe you're willing to suffer that creature. We have discussed this, Qui-Gon sighed heavily, his long fingers massaging his temples to preemptively intercept his oncoming headache. It wasn't working. You are delusional if you think that creature will help you blend in, Master. His very existence is causing a disturbance in the Force. The Master looked pointedly at his apprentice. Would you rather I leave him here with you? Force guide you, Master. I pray for your swift return. Qui-Gon smiled slyly at the boy, turning away from him and going to drag the aquatic creature through the sand to the trading port that was, supposedly, somewhere hidden in the desert. Obi Wan sighed as he watched his master and the flailing menace start off through the sand when one of the Queen's handmaidens, dressed in light traveling gear, sprinted past the young Jedi, a huffing Captain Panaka following at a weary jog. Oh no. Kenobi watched in slack-jawed disbelief as the young woman talked to his master, gesturing strongly and stamping her little foot in the sand. Qui-Gon's head bowed in what looked like defeat, and the handmaiden's demeanor shifted from forceful to pleased. He had a bad feeling about this. Master? Master? Qui-Gon looked to his shouting apprentice, and his shoulders dropped. A word, please. The Jedi Master sighed heavily, indicating to the handmaiden and the Gungan to stay put as he made his way to his Padawan. The Master sighed wearily, tired eyes observing Kenobi, arms crossed tightly over his chest. Yes. Are you sure you want to leave me behind, Master? I really think I can help you, and it looks like you're going to need it. Obi-Wan. Because, call me crazy, but I don't think an amphibious fish idiot and a prepubescent girl are going to be much help when you're pressed for time in a hostile environment. We've been over this, yes, but things are different now. Now you're babysitting. Yes, and I don't need to be watching after you as well. Qui-Gon instantly regretted his words when his Padawan recoiled, his blue eyes hurt, and his handsome face so easy to read. The Master sighed heavily, his hand covering his eyes. I'm sorry, Obi-Wan, that was unworthy. I am frustrated, as you are. The situation is less than ideal. I don't trust anyone else to handle matters here. It needs to be you. Anyone else would act foolishly or rashly, but you will not. Kenobi's face was cold, hard, but after a moment his features softened, to Qui-Gon's considerable relief. I understand, Master. Thank you. But I'm worried about you. This doesn't bode well at all. Call me if you need anything and I will be there. The Master smiled and patted the younger man on the shoulder, smiling wearily as he trudged back to his companions, and Obi-Wan couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't going to go as planned. Nothing is ever easy or simple, is it? He sighed, watching his master and his two burdens until they disappeared behind one of the sand dunes. He didn't like this. Not any of this. Obi-Wan was inclined to blame the sand for making everyone on edge and irritable, himself included. The young Jedi turned to walk up the extended ramp into the ship, stomping his boots to shake any clinging sand off. This job was bad enough without tracking the much-hated sand onto the ridiculously elaborate ship. By the time the suns began their descent and the sky began to be stained red with their departure, it was becoming very obvious that sandstorm looming on the horizon was not, in fact, going away. No, from the look of it, it seemed to be drawing closer at an alarming rate. The crew of the ship, the handmaidens and the Queen, all seemed to be in a state of mild panic. After all, they were all unfamiliar with this weather condition, and nobody knew what to expect. Except for Obi-Wan. He was just getting bored. Being cooped up in the ship was proving to be more vexing than the sand and heat outside, which led young Kenobi on a restless back and forth between the confines of the ship and the windy, sandy dunes. This, of course, just heightened his irritation. He understood the need for him to remain behind, but it made him restless to know his master was out doing important work, while he had to remain behind to make certain nobody did anything stupid. He sighed, running his hand through his short, blonde hair and rubbing his fingers on one of the ship's consoles. The sandstorm was beginning to interfere with their sensors and communications, and he had yet to hear from Qui-Gon, so there goes the hope that they might leave that day. It seemed that his master was always leaving him behind to guard royalty while he scouted ahead and did the dangerous work. Satine wasn't technically royalty, but all the Sith criffing hells, she sure did act like it. He sat up a little straighter when he heard soft footsteps approaching from behind him. Master Jedi? A soft female voice asked. I'm not a master, he said under his breath, twisting his braid between his fingers and turning to meet the red hooded figure of one of the Queen's handmaidens. Can I help you? The Queen requests your presence. She is distressed. Yeah, who isn't? He sighed as he rose from the chair, smoothing out his robes. Your name was? Brave, Master Jedi. Please, just call me Obi Wan, or Kenobi, or just not that. The young woman flushed a shade of red that matched the vibrant red of her robes, and Obi Wan arched an eyebrow at her sudden discomfort. If Satine taught him anything, it was that women were exceedingly complex. This one was reinforcing that notion. As you wish, Master Kenobi. The Jedi groaned, running his hand over his face briefly. Be strong, Kenobi. Be strong, you can tell the Queen that there's nothing to be concerned about. I have every faith that Master Qui-Gon will be back very soon with the parts we need, so if she would just exercise some patience, he resumed twirling his braid nonchalantly. That, or he will die in this storm. The Trade Federation will succeed in locating this ship and kill us all, or worse, leave us to die in the sand. One of the two. The Jedi smirked softly as he watched the handmaiden's face run the gauntlet of emotions, from relief, to nervousness, to abject horror. Why you don't think? Relax, I'm joking. Mostly. You can tell Her Highness that it's fine and there's nothing to worry about. But the message. He had just started sinking back into the chair when he stopped, hand gripping the back of the seat tightly. What message? She beckoned him to follow, and he went after her, following her quick steps with his own long stride. They received a communication? How? He had been sitting at the comm channel nearly the entire time. Most of the time. Well, nearly most of the time. The time that he wasn't outside scanning the sand dunes, or pacing the length of the ship, or failing to calm his mind with meditation when he wasn't doing those things, he was at the comm channel. When he got to the bridge, Captain Panaka, the Queen and her handmaidens, were re-watching a choppy hologram of an Naboo official. The interference was making it difficult to understand him, but the phrases death toll rising and bow to their wishes and contact immediately could be clearly heard, and it was all Obi Wan needed. It's clearly a trick, the Jedi said sternly, crossing his arms in front of his chest and mimicking his master to the best of his ability. Send no reply, send no transmission at all. But you didn't even hear, the Queen began, but Obi-Wan held up his hand, and she fell silent. I don't need to hear the rest to know it's a trick. It's clearly a trick. They're trying to locate us, which means they don't know where we are. That's good. We can't squander this advantage. Don't play into their hands, Your Highness. The Queen stared at him for a long moment, her head held up regally, but there was clearly fear and uncertainty in those eyes. Obi-Wan could emphasize, though a Jedi was not to feel these things, the young Jedi often felt lost without the guidance of his master, much like the young Queen must have felt lost without her advisors. He smiled softly, the harsh edge leaving his face and his voice. Don't you worry, Your Highness. We'll be on the way soon. Her brown eyes met his blue, and that seemed to do it for her. She nodded, satisfied in the course of action he had set for her, and he turned on his heels and left the bridge for the engines. He needed to go fiddle with the mechanics of the ship and try to reach Qui-Gon. This was why his master left him behind. Because of things like this. Satisfied that he had completed his job in a way his master would be proud of, he hit the access console to admit him to the ship's engines. It was well after midnight when Obi-Wan was contacted by Qui-Gon. His comm flashed, beeping incessantly to indicate the call, and the young Jedi had to untangle himself from some of the ship's wiring to reach over and accept the call. The button was tapped, and the blue hologram of his master appeared. Obi-Wan, can you read me? Loud and clear, Master. The Padawan went back to digging around in the engines. I tried to contact you earlier, but the sandstorm was causing too much interference, and I couldn't get through. Did anything happen? Obi-Wan nodded, flicking his braid behind his shoulder as he turned to face the hologram, giving his master his full attention. Yes, the governor of Naboo tried to contact the Queen about her people suffering. It was clearly a trap. He was asking about our location. Qui-Gon nodded pensively. The Trade Federation doesn't know where we are, then. That was my conclusion as well, Master. He probably was not lying about the state of his people, though. The Jedi Master brought his hand to his chin, thinking deeply for a moment before he nodded. You've done well, Obi-Wan. Kenobi's chest swelled with pride, and a bright smile graced his already handsome face, and Qui-Gon couldn't help but smile at his Padawan. Thank you, Master. I'm sorry I doubted you. You were right to trust in the Force. I'll do better. Yes, about that. Something about his master's tone set his stomach into knots, and his smile faded, eyebrows knit close together as he searched the Force for his master's intent before he said anything. The Force did bring us here. I found something. Please, Master, please say it's the parts we need. Well, yes, I did find those. His worries eased away, and his blue eyes shone with excitement. Really? Master, that's fantastic. I had serious doubts that you could find them. With any luck, we could leave by tomorrow. Obi-Wan, I can have those installed and online within an hour of getting them." Kenobi laughed, leaning back against the engine he was tinkering with, fingers running excitedly through the loose and exposed wires. "With any luck, we can be back home in the GD temple in time for lunch." "Obi-Wan, focus," his master softly admonished, and the excited youth quieted down, his blue eyes laughing, and a charming smirk upon his handsome face. "I found them, yes, but I do not have them, not yet. So you'll pay for them in the morning, then we'll have them." "It's not that simple. There's something else." "No, master, it is that simple." The knot in his stomach grew tighter, and the young Kenobi was becoming grateful that he had been too on edge to eat dinner. Emptying his stomach into the engines would not help this ship fly. Qui-Gon was dancing around something. What else could have happened? How much damage could that Gungan do in one afternoon? Qui-Gon crossed his arms, looking at Obi-Wan so sternly that he could feel the intensity of his gaze through the Force itself, and the Padawan held his tongue, ears burning in embarrassment. He hated when his master did that. "We will have the parts we need, young one. We need to discuss the other thing." "What other thing?" Obi-Wan huffed as he took a grip on his braid and pulled at it. "What did the Gungan do?" "Nothing, well, a great many things, actually, but, sweet Force, is the Gungan dead?" "Master, did you kill the Gungan for the mission?" Obi-Wan. "Because if you did, Master, you're my hero." "Criffing heck, Obi." Nothing that could be said could wipe the smirk on the Padawan's face. Qui-Gon huffed, eyes closed in concentration as he attempted to stave off the frustration. "I found a boy." "A boy," the GD repeated, his face going completely blank as the knot in his stomach grew. "Not this again." "Master, what boy?" "I found a boy here, a slave that works in the shop where we're getting the parts from. I can sense he's strong in the Force." "Master, unusually strong, Obi-Wan. Stronger than I have ever sensed." Kenobi scoffed at this, rolling his eyes at what he saw as another of his master's lost causes. "Master, you're exaggerating. You've been in the presence of the GD Council hundreds of times, you've trained with Master Yoda. His potential is greater than Master Yoda." There was a moment of tension, of incredible strain in the Force between Master and Padawan despite the distance. The clear blue eyes of Obi-Wan bore into the hologram, as if his master was standing right before him, as if his gaze could burn the stupidity from the older GD. "I've never seen anything like it, young one," Qui-Gon said softly. "This one is something special." "Master, is this the same kind of special as our Gungan friend?" "This is different, Obi-Wan, don't be sassy. I need to investigate this further." That did it for Kenobi. He jumped up from where he was sitting and began pacing wildly, like an animal that had been caged, which he supposed he was, since the prospect of staying longer was suddenly a very real possibility, while his master chased pointless causes. Again. "What about the mission, Master? We have a queen to protect, we need to get her back to Coruscant." "I know, Obi-Wan. Listen." The harsh tone was enough to stop the young man's pacing, but he was glaring at the hologram. "I have not forgotten the mission. I know what we must do, but you don't get to decide what's important, the Force does. I was brought here for a reason. The Force has willed this. I cannot ignore this." The Padawan sat in front of the engine, defeated. "You're going to look like a fool in front of the council again." "Maybe so, but if they are wise, they will heed me." "They won't, Master, you know they won't. If you just listen to the code." "Obi-Wan, you have much to learn." Qui-Gon fell silent as he watched his apprentice turn away, shake his head, then refocus on him, his eyes steely and cold. "The code is a guideline, yes, but it is just that, a guideline. Not a rule book. If the Force takes us elsewhere, we must follow, do you understand?" He was silent a long time, looking at the hologram of his master and doubting everything. His place in this mission, his place in the Force, everything. He felt like he was a child again, learning the basics of the GD code in a room full of other younglings. His uncertainty shook his entire being, so much so he could feel the Force around him tremble, could feel his master's comforting touch through their bond reach out to him. He had so much to learn, he understood that. "Be humble, Obi-Wan," he admonished himself, "be modest. You don't know better than your master." He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and smiled sheepishly at the hologram. "You deserve to be on the council, Master. If you just follow the code." "That may not be my path, Padawan," Qui-Gon said softly. "I accept that, as must you." Now, he clapped his hands together, smiling broadly at the young GD. "Get some rest, Obi-Wan Kenobi. I have this under control." "I know, Master." He smiled softly, feeling much more at ease. Qui-Gon knew what he was doing. Everything was going to be fine. Good. I will contact you after the Padres tomorrow. Yes, the wait. What? Master, what Padres? For the parts. I wagered the ship against the parts that my racer will win. Obi Wan couldn't stop himself from burying his face in his hands. Master, that's a terrible idea. We're going to be out a ship if you lose. Can you even race a pod? Of course not, young one, the boy is going to race for me. The boy? I can win the parts we need and test out my hunch about the boy at the same time. Even you would approve of this, it's efficient. Yes, I suppose, but he bit his tongue before he continued. No, Master, no, I don't approve. This is madness. Trust in the Force, Obi-Wan. I'll talk to you tomorrow. And with that, the hologram of his master flickered into nothingness. He didn't know how long he sat there staring at where the image of Qui-Gon Jinn had been moments before, but by the time he moved, his muscles were aching, his head throbbed, and he was terribly hungry. He didn't exactly know what happened, but he did know this. The Force was perfectly content to send Obi-Wan Kenobi into an early, frustrated grave. May the Force be with me so I may be constantly vexed. Did the code forbid drinking? Because he needed one badly. Obi-Wan spent his night in meditation. He was restless and frustrated, and this mission was putting undue strain on both him and his master. He did not wish to be a problem, especially for the Jedi Knight he admired above all others. He took a deep breath, his long-fingered hands resting on his crossed legs. There is no emotion, there is peace. He was struggling with this one as of late, so much so that the Force around him felt unstable. He was unbalanced, that much he knew. But why? Why was he having such difficulty achieving the peace that graced his master? True, he struggled with this in the past, but he had greatly improved after his mission on Mandalore guarding the Grand Duchess. He had learned a great deal from Satine, and her overpowering emotion and passion helped him find a way to keep his own passions in check. But now something had changed. He and Qui-Gon often disagreed on the ways of the Force, the adherence to the code, the role of the Jedi. His master would actively go against the Jedi code if he felt it was the right thing to do, but Obi-Wan believed in the Jedi code above all else, believed it was put in place for a reason. They disagreed often, but it wasn't usually so hostile. Why? Why was it like this? He sharply inhaled. There is no emotion, there is peace. It was this mission, it had to be, starting with his master's insistence on dragging that Gungan around, and then the difficult rescue of the Queen, their foiled escape from Naboo, their unscheduled landing on Tatooine, the Padres, all that sand. He shook his head, breathed deeply when he realized everything about him had suddenly tensed up. No, it wasn't any of that. None of those things had any bearing on his emotions. This was his fault, it came from within. But why? His even breathing allowed him to relax, and he reached deep into the Force, felt the sleeping fitful presence of the people on the ship, felt the calming energy of his master that just seemed too far away, and something else. His mouth twitched in concentration. Whatever it was, he couldn't place it, but something was off, unbalancing the Force just enough to catch his attention when he searched deep enough. There is no ignorance, there is knowledge. He needed to find out the trouble, both with himself and with the Force, that much was clear. The Force was fog to him at the moment, and his own mind was turbulent and chaotic, but he could work through that. He was calmer now, his whole being open to the comforts of the Force, and it soothed his mind, made things much more clear. Obi-Wan had been with his master a long time, since he was a child, and it was becoming very clear that it wouldn't be long before the Jedi Council called for him to undergo his trial and become a Jedi Knight. He wasn't ready, not even close, and this mission made that extremely obvious. He might have a year left with his master, 2 if he was lucky, and he would be on his own. It was frightening. The admission of his fear made Obi-Wan feel lighter, somehow. He understood, smiled softly as relief washed over him. This was easily solved. There is no ignorance, there is knowledge, he said under his breath. All he needed to do was talk to Master Qui-Gon, apologize for his bad behavior, explain his fears, and all would be well. There is no passion, there is serenity. That was becoming more true every second as his worries and anxiety drifted into the Force as he gained an understanding of himself. He always found the code calming, and that was especially true now. There is no chaos, there is harmony. Yes, but something wasn't right. Kenobi shook his head, breathed deeply. Not now, not yet. There is no death, there is the Force. The Jedi exhaled slowly, mastering himself once again. This wasn't so bad. All of this was simply a momentary setback, and all things were a part of the plan of the Force. All he needed to do was trust in it. There is no emotion, there is peace, he spoke softly, truly believing it for the first time in days. There is no ignorance, there is knowledge. There is no passion, there is serenity. He chanted the mantra often when he felt lost, and the Force always found a way to make him feel grounded in the code, as he did now. There is no chaos, there is harmony. There is no death, there is the Force. He sighed, sinking himself further into his meditations, fully relaxed at last. All he needed to do was talk to his master. But that's not it, is it? His brows knit together in intense concentration. With his mind clear, the Force laid itself out before him. All this felt wrong from the very start. From the moment they set foot on the Trade Federation ship and this whole mess of a mission began, Obi Wan had felt that something was off. He expressed such to his master, but Qui-Gon felt nothing, and the Padawan brushed it off as mere anxiety. But it wasn't, that much was clear now, because the same bad feeling had followed him since then, its incessant presence setting the young man on edge. This wasn't anxiety, this was something rippling in the Force, something cold. Obi-Wan stood and stretched after his long meditation, his blue eyes drifting to the window and seeing the first sliver of one of the twin suns of Tatooine appearing over the sand dunes. Things were becoming clear to him now. By the time Qui-Gon contacted him, he'd have a firm understanding of what was going on, he was certain of it. It was just after noon when Obi-Wan spotted his master, the handmaiden, and the Gungan approaching the ship on the backs of pack animals, and the Padawan's heart lifted as he ran out to greet them. I was getting worried, he said softly, helping the Jedi as he dismounted. Getting? I feel you have been worried, young one. Yes, well, he twirled his braid, felt his ears burn red with embarrassment. Before he had a chance to speak, Qui-Gon swiftly went to help the handmaiden unload a heavy package from the back of one of the animals. This is the hyperdrive generator, please get it installed immediately, Obi-Wan. As soon as the parts were unloaded, Qui-Gon jumped up onto the animal he was previously riding. I'm going back, I have some unfinished business. Business? Master? He felt his previous anxiety return full force. His master's recklessness was unsettling. Qui-Gon looked down at his fidgeting Padawan, sighed softly, and dismounted, draping his arm around the boy's shoulders and leading him away. I won't be long. I sense you've picked up another stray, Master. It's the boy I talked to you about last night. He's responsible for winning the bet I made, we wouldn't have the parts without him. The feeling was back. The anxiety, the uncertainty, the faint cold threads in the Force. He gave his master a cold, hard stare, said nothing, and turned back toward the ship. There is no emotion, there is peace. Obi-Wan bit the inside of his cheek, breathed deeply, and turned back to the older Jedi. Master, he stepped to him swiftly, stood before his impressive height and bowed his head. Master, I apologize. These past few days I have behaved badly, Kenobi's voice quivered with emotion that he was trying to suppress. There is no emotion. Hush, Obi-Wan. I have been plagued with fears and, well, he huffed reaching up to pull at his braid. This was much harder than it was when he was practicing this earlier. Keep it simple, Kenobi. He took a deep breath and began again. I know you're in a rush, we can talk later. But Master, I need to warn you. I feel something wrong in the Force. There's a great disturbance. I cannot see why, but I beg you, Master, exercise caution. Qui-Gon was silent for a moment, eyes cast down at the sand before nodding slowly. You mentioned this before. Perhaps you are right. I will remain mindful. He smiled softly. Thank you, Obi-Wan. The Padawan nodded, smiling softly. I can have us off the ground in an hour. Are you sure you have to go back? I'm sure of this, yes. Very well. But when you return, we need to talk, all right. Qui-Gon nodded and turned away to climb back on the pack animal. Kenobi watched as he headed off toward the town once again, and when he was out of view, the Padawan headed into the ship to install the hyperdrive. He couldn't shake the feeling that something awful was about to happen. As he walked up the ship's ramp, the handmaiden that accompanied his master to Mos Espa came out to meet him. Master Jedi, please, I'm not a master. The young woman observed him for a moment with large brown eyes, before nodding. Very well. What should I call you, then? Obi-Wan's fine. You? She extended her hand without a second of hesitation, so very unlike the other handmaiden he had met earlier. Padme. He sighed, took her hand for a moment. I need to get these installed, if you'll excuse me. He strode up the ramp and headed toward the engine, but the girl followed. Can I help you? How were things here? Did anything happen? Nothing of note, he said softly, shrugging off his cloak and rolling up his sleeves. Why? I like to know what happens around a queen. If you were so interested in that, why did you not stay behind? He removed the engine panels, his blue eyes observing the girl, who seemed to flush slightly, but it could have been the light of the engines. He did sense her heart beat faster, though, and he couldn't help but smirk. The Queen needed a representative on the mission. I see, but I would have rather been here, of course. Obi Wan chuckled as he placed the first generator into its place and began making the necessary attachments. The girl was so passionate, so alive, and the Jedi found it extremely endearing. There is no passion, there is serenity. Of course. The Jedi worked quickly, his nimble fingers easily setting to the task at hand. In his youth, he took a liking to mechanics, figured he'd be a pilot, and was shown to be quite talented at it. However, as his talent in the Force grew, it became clear that his path would take him elsewhere. He just finished with the first generator and placed the second in place when the intense stare of the young woman became too much. Do you need something, or do you just like the view? She opened her mouth to respond before she processed what he had said, and when his words sunk in, her face turned an unmistakable shade of red, even in the light of the engines. Obi-Wan smirked, thoroughly amused by the girl. The boy we met in town was a mechanic as well. Are all Jedi inclined toward mechanics? The boy is not a Jedi, Obi-Wan huffed. My master thinks he's Force sensitive, and he may be, but that doesn't make him a Jedi. A Jedi is more than that, it's a way of life. He sighed, running his hand over his short hair and tossing his braid over his shoulder. But no, not all of us like mechanics. Force knows Master Qui-Gon doesn't, his talent at taking strays in. Like yourself? His blue eyes shot to the girl, narrowed for a moment and studied her features, her small mouth upturned into a devious, clever smirk. He relaxed. She was teasing. Not quite, no. He didn't find me, he sighed, attaching the necessary couplings to the generator. I suppose that's one way of looking at it. I guess I just don't really understand you, Jedi. No, most people don't. Obi-Wan smiled at her softly. The Force is a mystery to most people, myself included. It's difficult to explain, even with a lifetime of training. She kneeled next to him, picking up the panel to cover the generator. I'd like to learn more about it. Would you? He grabbed the other end of the panel and helped her replace it. I could attempt to educate you, if you like. I'm still learning, but Master Qui-Gon always says that you learn by teaching. I'd like that. She smiled, and Kenobi couldn't help but think about Satine, her own passion, her own thirst for knowledge. They had similar conversations in the past, and though he never got the chance to educate her on the nature of the Jedi and the Force, it was something he often desired to do one day. He smiled much more gently than he had in the past few days, and was suddenly very keenly aware of how close he was to the handmaiden. The Padawan backed away quickly, face flushed and nervously laughing as he stood. Sorry, he offered his hand to her and helped pull her to her feet. Thank you for the company. Replacing generators is a dull affair. You are very welcome, Obi-Wan. He smiled sheepishly at the ground, but only for a moment before the air around him seemed to grow still. He didn't have a chance to move before he heard light, swift feet reverberating through the ship, the voice of a young boy calling for help. He and Padme dashed from the engine room together, nearly barreling into a small, blonde boy that Obi-Wan had to assume was Qui-Gon's little racer. The boy was gasping, eyes wide. Please? He yelled, frantic and unsure. Qui-Gon's in trouble. There it is again. His blue eyes shot toward the ship's ramp and ran toward it, shielding his eyes against the sun's and searching for his master. I feel it, Master, where are you? The Force was opened up to him, and he could see it tremble, could feel the cold grip him, but this was not like before. This was intense, as if his entire being was suddenly chilled by this new presence. It was just a quick flash, but his sharp eyes picked up what looked like the clash of lightsabers on top of a sand dune before it disappeared behind it. Panic seized the young Jedi, held him in its grasp as he continued to feel the chill grow stronger, and he dashed down the ramp, coming to a swift stop before he raced out into the sand. Calm, Kenobi, focus. He took a breath, his blue eyes focused on the spot that saw the sparks, and with a clear mind, he rushed back into the ship, tearing toward the cockpit. He threw himself into the pilot's seat and immediately powered the ship up. He could never got to Qui-Gon in time on foot. This was the best option. Master Jedi. Captain Panaka appeared behind him, grasping the back of the pilot's seat as Obi-Wan lifted the ship off the ground and turned it toward the place where he felt his master. Qui-Gon's in trouble, take the seat, fly right over that dune over there. Kenobi tersely commanded as he leapt out of the seat, hitting the ramp extension as he dashed out of the cockpit. He tore through the ship as fast as he could, unclipping his lightsaber from his belt as he reached the access hatch and slammed the console, the airlocks opening, and he rushed out onto the extended ramp, squinting against the wind as the ship flew low over the dunes. Then he saw them, his master, his green lightsaber activated and swinging gracefully, defensively against his assailant. A creature dressed in black with Obi Wan blinked, shook his head, and looked again to confirm. A lightsaber. The creature was holding a red lightsaber, and this creature was trained, his strikes fast, athletic, and highly aggressive. There is no death, there is the Force. Master. Kenobi clipped his lightsaber back onto his belt, got a grip on the ramp, and extended his hand to his master. It was all Qui-Gon needed. Without looking, the Jedi Master back flipped away from the other combatant, reaching his hand out and grasped Obi-Wan's forearm. The Padawan grabbed his master and with all his effort, pulled him up onto the ramp. The man in black wasted no time in jumping after the Jedi, but a swift swing from Qui-Gon was enough to make the snarling aggressor retract his hand and fall short of the ramp. With a pained grunt, the master stumbled into the ship. Obi-Wan went to follow, but stopped suddenly and looked over the ramp just in time to see the creature land on his feet on the dune below. An outraged, feral howl cut through the roar of the engines as the man looked up at the Jedi Padawan that stood on the ramp. Kenobi held his breath as he looked at his master's attacker, his bright red skin, tribal tattoos and horned head, the least animalistic thing about this creature. Face twisted in rage, he glared at the Jedi, and Obi-Wan locked eyes with the man, piercing yellow boring into him, and the cold returned stronger than before, a physical chill that sent goosebumps up the Jedi's arms. There is only the Force. The ship began to ascend, and Obi-Wan ran inside before they picked up speed. He hit the control console, sealing the airlock and folding the landing ramp under the ship before he ran to Qui-Gon, who sat on the floor, surrounded by Padme and the young boy. He was out of breath, but the Jedi didn't seem hurt, just stunned. "Master, are you all right? What was that thing?" Qui-Gon shook his head. "I don't know, but he was trained in the Jedi arts. I sensed it, Master, he was strong in the Force." "You sensed it long before I," the Master said wearily, standing on shaking legs. "This may be what you were feeling before, young one. Don't second-guess yourself anymore, you're more on point than I." Obi-Wan opened his mouth to speak, but the young boy cut him off with a quick and worried, "What if he comes back? What are we going to do?" Qui-Gon looked at the boy and then looked at his apprentice, who now looked at the boy as well, his face seeming to demand, "What do you mean we? We will be patient," he said softly, answering the young blonde. "I have no doubt he will find us again, and when he does, we will be ready." The blazing, intensely focused gaze of his Padawan had not left the new addition to the ship, and the master sighed. "Anakin Skywalker, meet Obi-Wan Kenobi." "Wow, are you a Jedi Knight too?" Obi-Wan looked from the boy to his master and rolled his eyes in despair. He had a bad feeling about this as well, and he could still feel the cold chill deep in his chest. The large, luxurious ship was far, far too small for three Force-sensitive beings, Obi-Wan concluded as he paced the halls and ran into Qui-Gon, Anakin, or both of them nearly everywhere he went. The young man had no desire to see either of them at the moment, but it seemed as though the Force was willing them all together. He couldn't handle it at the moment, and pacing the ship in search of a secluded space was all he could do to keep from tearing his braid out. He eventually settled on a return to the engine room, despite the loud humming of the hyperdrive. He sat in the most secluded corner he could find, drawing his knees to his chest and wrapping his arms around them, shivering slightly. The cold he had felt was receding, but it was still present in the Force. Obi-Wan suspected that the mere memory of that feeling was keeping it present, and he took a deep breath, tried to remember his master's teachings. "Be mindful of the present, Obi-Wan." Qui-Gon told him this often, but it was difficult for the Padawan to do this, unlike his master, who seemed to thrive in the present. All this did was reinforce his need for further training. Kenobi couldn't imagine what his master planned to do with the boy. He was far too old for training, so what? Did he want to parade him in front of the council to show them a child that was stronger in the Force than they were? He shook his head, embarrassed for his master. Nothing would come of this, Qui-Gon had to see that. This was barely worth thought. What was worth meditation, though, was the creature they had seen on Tatooine. What was it? Why was he there? What did he come for? Was it simply an assassin sent for the Queen? That seemed unlikely, not if. Obi-Wan's breath hitched as he felt his master's presence reach out to him, warm, comforting and soothing, and the chill in him receded to the presence of the Jedi Master. The Padawan stood. His master needed him. He turned to leave for Qui-Gon's quarters, but he stopped for a moment as the impulse to block his master out and sit back down entered his mind. Then the moment was gone, and Obi-Wan clenched his jaw, angry at himself for even having the thought at all. He was ungrateful to even have the thought, and he shook his head violently, as if he could banish any trace from his mind. His long stride carried him through the ship to his master's room, and he stopped before the closed door and gently knocked. The tired, quiet voice beckoned him to enter, and Obi-Wan's fingers swept over the console, stepping inside as the door hissed open, closing again quickly behind him. "You called, Master?" Qui-Gon nodded, gesturing for his apprentice to kneel before where he sat meditating. When the boy sat before him, legs crossing before him, the master sighed softly. "You wished to speak with me before. What is it?" Obi-Wan shook his head. "It can wait until we're back at home, after everything's settled with the council." Qui-Gon nodded, and the Padawan continued. "But we do need to discuss something else." The master arched his eyebrow. "Obi-Wan, if this is about Anakin." "It isn't, Master." The blue eyes narrowed. Again with the boy. "I don't know what you have in mind for him, but whatever it is, it's a foregone conclusion." The older man frowned, opened his mouth to speak, but Obi-Wan quickly cut in with, "We have much more important things to talk about." "That creature, Master." There was silence for a moment, and Kenobi thought that his master wouldn't let the matter slide so easily, that he would insist on a discussion about the child. But the master nodded slightly, softly said, "I agree." "Thoughts?" "I saw him after you went back into the ship. His eyes were yellow, Master, and when I looked at him I felt cold. In the desert, I was freezing." Qui-Gon stroked his beard, his eyes distant for a moment before quietly saying, "You seem to have been sensing him for a while now. The cold you feel, is it the same feeling you had before?" Obi-Wan nodded. "I still feel it, Master. Not as strongly as before, but it is still there. The Force is disturbed." "I agree, but I am not sensing it like you are." His fingers drummed on his leg, the master's intelligent eyes darting about the room, as if seeing something that the Padawan could not see. "I need you to monitor this, Obi-Wan. You saw him, you felt the Force around him, and you can recognize it. We will not be caught off guard again." "I understand, Master." Obi-Wan paused, uncertain if he should ask what was on his mind, but Qui-Gon nodded to him, sensing his hesitation, and the Padawan continued. "Master, we're dealing with a Force-sensitive individual with yellow eyes and a red lightsaber. It can't be coincidence." "I agree. We could be dealing with a Sith Lord." There was silence between them, the words hanging heavy over the two Jedi, and Obi-Wan was almost afraid to breathe. It was as if his master spoke something forbidden, like just saying the words would make them true. It was frightening, and then what? Kenobi brought his hand to his chest, felt his heart beating at an accelerated rate. Was he afraid? Or was this excitement that he felt pounding through his body? "Master?" he said softly, willing his pulse to calm. "Will the council accept this?" "I don't know, Obi-Wan, but I think we might be in for it." The next morning found Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi reporting to the Jedi Council. They bid goodbye to the Queen, the Gungan, and Anakin, and departed to make their report, now that their mission was over. And here they stood, in a room filled with the most powerful Jedi alive, and Obi-Wan felt as if he and his master were children that were just caught yelling profanities at their grandmother. It was horribly awkward, and he shifted uncomfortably next to Qui-Gon, having trouble keeping his tongue as he promised the elder Jedi he would. It was made worse by the fact that the council seemed to not believe them. It was Mace Windu that spoke first. "How could the Sith rise without our knowledge? Hard to see, the dark side is," Master Yoda said softly, but when the diminutive Jedi spoke, he seemed much bigger than he was. "My Padawan sensed it," Qui-Gon said almost proudly, and Obi-Wan cast his eyes to the ground, both humbled and proud. Long before we encountered him, Obi-Wan felt the disturbance the dark side was causing. The Masters continued to discuss and debate the possibility of the Sith, and Kenobi tuned out entirely, eyes closed and reaching into the Force. The disturbance he felt was gone, the cold chill faded to simply a memory. As he expected, the close of this mission ended the Padawan's heightened level of anxiety and unease. They were home now. Everything was going to be fine. Being in the presence of the council was comforting to Kenobi, despite the unease he felt from his master. He reached out to Qui-Gon through the Force, attempting to calm and comfort the master, but the Jedi's defenses were up, and Obi-Wan frowned when he could not get through to him. This was unlike his master. Something wasn't right. "Remain with the Naboo Queen, you must," Yoda commanded. "We will unravel the mystery of your attacker," Mace promised, steeping his fingers together. "May the Force be with you," Qui-Gon Jinn. Obi Wan bowed, turned on his heels to leave, but stopped when Qui-Gon did not move. He looked over his shoulder at his master, holding his breath for what he knew was coming. "Please, master, don't. More to say, have you?" Yoda asked, and Qui-Gon took a deep breath. "I've discovered a vergence in the Force." The council was on edge before with talk of Sith, but this was too much for them. The chamber erupted in talking and debate and disbelief, and didn't stop until Yoda tapped his staff against the ground, the echo silencing the Jedi Masters. Obi-Wan felt as though his heart had stopped. "Around what?" Mace asked, and Qui-Gon held his head high. "Around a person. I have brought the boy here, I asked that he be tested." The room fell silent, and all the Masters' eyes were focused hard on Qui-Gon Jinn. Obi-Wan's ears burned, certain that his face was bright red as well, embarrassed on his master's behalf. All eyes slowly turned to Yoda. After a silence that felt like an eternity to Kenobi, the Grand Master quietly said, "To be trained as a Jedi, your request for him?" "Finding him was the will of the Force," Qui-Gon said confidently, recklessly pressing ahead, as always, and his Padawan couldn't find it in him to look away from the ground. It was Mace Windu that finally spoke. "Bring him before us, then. There is no emotion, there is peace, there is no ignorance, there is knowledge, there is no passion, there is serenity, there is no chaos, there is harmony, there is no death, there is the Force, there is no emotion, there is peace." The rest of Obi-Wan's day passed quickly as he followed his master about, but the young Jedi was not present, not really. He was lost in the Force, repeating the code over and over in an endless loop. He was frustrated and embarrassed for his master, who, once again, was overstepping his bounds. The boy could not be trained, he was too old. This outcome was decided before this even began, and the Padawan wished desperately that his master would stop pursuing hopeless causes. They stood now on a balcony outside the council's chambers as they tested Anakin, the sun setting over Coruscant. They hadn't spoken all day, not verbally or through the Force. Obi-Wan's defenses were up as he meditated, worried that if he stopped for a second, he would be unable to hold his tongue, and the two would argue again. He would say nothing. The master stood, arms crossed, waiting patiently. He wouldn't say a word. Qui-Gon's defenses were up, Obi-Wan could sense it. The master must have felt his Padawan's displeasure. "Not a word, hold your tongue, Kenobi." Qui-Gon shifted his weight to the other foot. "Peace, knowledge, serenity, harmony, Force. The boy will not pass the council's tests, Master," Obi-Wan said softly, unable to keep his silence a moment longer, "and you know it. He is far too old." The master didn't even look toward his apprentice. "Anakin will become a Jedi, I promise you. Don't defy the council, Master, not again." "I will do as I must, Obi-Wan. You could be on the council by now," Kenobi said, raising his voice. "You should be on the council. If you just followed the code. Master, you deserve to be on the council." Finally, the Jedi Master looked at his Padawan, studied him carefully, the burst of emotion leaving his blue eyes sharp and angry. The master smiled. "You still have much to learn, my young Padawan." Obi-Wan bit off his reply, stared at the ground, and refused to meet his master's gaze. Qui-Gon was right, of course. Kenobi knew he was right. After this farce was over, he resolved to talk to his master in private about his fears. They needed to be known. The council chamber doors creaked open, and both Jedi turned to see Jedi Master Shakti, indicating that they follow her. They entered the chamber, and the Togruta retook her seat. Qui-Gon went to stand behind Anakin, and Obi-Wan stood back, leaning on one of the pillars at the edge of the chamber, willing himself to melt into the shadows. There was silence for a long while before Yoda softly spoke the words that Qui-Gon Jinn had been waiting to hear. "Correct you were, Qui-Gon." Obi-Wan could feel his master's satisfaction. "He is to be trained, then," Qui-Gon said softly, relieved. Mace Windu leaned forward, dark eyes intense. "No," he said softly. "He will not be trained." Qui-Gon was shocked, stunned into perfect silence as he examined the faces of the council and ignored the "I told you so" look Obi-Wan was giving him. "No?" he finally managed weakly, and Mace nodded. "He is too old, there's already too much anger in him." Clouded, the boy's future is, Yoda concurred, his wise eyes observing the Jedi Master, the Padawan, and the young boy before him. Qui-Gon was incensed, disbelief and anger coming off him in waves before he calmed down, stood tall and nodded, accepting the council's decision. "Very well," he said strongly, determined. "I will train him. I take Anakin Skywalker as my Padawan apprentice." Obi-Wan stiffened in shock, eyes wide, and he began trembling. This couldn't be happening. "Master, what are you doing?" "An apprentice you already have, Qui-Gon," Yoda admonished sharply, but the master did not waver. "We forbid this," Mace added, but Qui-Gon was not deterred. "Obi Wan is ready," the master insisted, and Obi Wan stepped away from his place in the shadows, panic gripping him. "Master, no, I'm not, He is headstrong, but he is capable," Qui-Gon continued, heedless of his young apprentice's pleading. "There is little more he can learn from me." What was said next was lost on Obi-Wan. All he could hear was the rushing of the wind, whether it be from his own blood surging through him, or the force growing turbulent like a storm around him, he could not say. It drowned out everything, his master, the council, the boy, everything, with no exception. He staggered back, hand touching the pillar behind him, and he leaned his weight against it, as if he could not stand on his own. His eyes darted about the room, observing the council, but seeing nothing. He shut his eyes tight, mumbled the code under his breath as he put up his mental defenses, not wishing to all these masters to sense his distress. When he opened his eyes, Obi-Wan's face was a mask of indifference, and he observed the council closely. All of them were focused on Qui-Gon and Anakin, the young boy crying and the master indignant, furiously arguing his point. If the masters sensed anything from Kenobi, they did not show it. All focus was on the Anakin, so strong in the force that his distress disturbed it. Kenobi stood there, halfway in the shadows, and observed it all in confusion. Why would his master do this? Not an hour earlier, Qui-Gon was telling him that he still had much to learn, so why? Was he replaceable? Was the thought of training Anakin too much to pass up? The boy was strong, it was true, but without the training, the conditioning, the discipline instilled at a young age, Anakin could never measure up to a real GD, could he? Obi-Wan remembered the conversation he had with Padme, how she said the boy was a skilled mechanic and a ridiculously talented pilot. Podracing was not just something that humans did, and certainly not something that humans won, and yet the boy did. Kenobi's own interest in mechanics and piloting mirrored Anakin's, and he was considered to be strong in the Force as well. The parallels were unmistakable, but Anakin surpassed him in every aspect. He was a more talented mechanic, certainly a better pilot, even at this young age, and Qui-Gon made it extremely clear that the boy's strength in the Force was unparalleled, worth defying the Council over. His sharp blue eyes flickered in the shadows he stood in, glaring at the young, crying boy. He was jealous, he realized. This boy was nothing yesterday, a slave on a desert world, and today he stood before the most powerful beings in the galaxy, being denied for training, but being defended by his master. Obi-Wan's fist clenched tightly, making certain to keep his mental walls in place. He spent most of his life with Qui-Gon Jinn, and now, the master was ready to just throw him away in favor of a better, more talented student. Qui-Gon knew Obi-Wan wasn't ready, he knew, he didn't care. He was being replaced, it was as simple as that. All those years together, all they had gone through together, his undying loyalty to Qui-Gon paid back in betrayal. Qui-Gon was still arguing with the council, so much so that Mace had gotten out of his chair to stand before the other master, an immovable wall. Nobody would pay attention to a mere Padawan in the presence of masters and the raw talent that was Anakin. Obi-Wan studied the masters for a moment before he slipped from the room. He didn't stop his quick stride through the temple until he got to his room, entered it quietly, and sealed the door behind him. For a while, he didn't move, just stood staring at the wall until the shaking of his knees couldn't hold his weight for a second longer. He leaned against the door and slowly slid to the floor, his hands shaking. This can't be happening. But it was. He wrapped his arms tightly around himself, reached out into the Force to find it turbulent, and it made him feel unbalanced, the familiar chill working its way back into his very core. At first, it was small cold threads reaching into his mind like a light touch, a warning, but as the minutes passed, the cold threads became a firm grip. "Why, Master?" Obi-Wan asked softly, shivering as confusion turned to betrayal and anger. He quietly whispered the code, but the words rang hollow to him. Everything in him was emotion and chaos, and nothing could stop it. He behaved badly on this mission, but he certainly didn't think Qui-Gon would be ready to get rid of him. He wasn't ready for the trials, they all knew it, and if anything, his disagreements with his master just further showed how unready he was to be a Jedi Knight. Discussing this with Qui-Gon seemed pointless now that he was championing the cause of Anakin Skywalker. His whole being was racked with jealousy once again, and he gripped himself tighter, the hairs on the back of his neck rising as a frigid chill gripped Kenobi and refused to let go. Obi-Wan woke up with the dawn, the light of the sun coming through his window and warming his face. He shut his eyes tight, trying to block the light out. He needed more sleep, he felt sore and stiff and not at all rested. But closing his eyes tighter was not enough to block out the bright sun shining in his face. He slowly squinted, blinking his stinging eyes and trying to rub the fatigue out of them. He was right where he had been last night, back against the door and huddled against the cold. He didn't remember falling asleep. He had thought he would have been too troubled for sleep, even if it wasn't restful. He breathed deeply, even his lungs felt tight, and he groaned as he pushed himself up, his entire body aching as he moved. He tentatively reached into the force, nervous about what he would find there, but the raging storm had calmed. It was still again, peaceful and serene, but the warm glow he felt from it was gone. Kenobi felt the cold in the force, not the bone-chilling freeze of last night, but icy tendrils that seemed to reach into his mind. He felt unbalanced. The same foreboding feeling he had before was back. Was he sensing the Sith again? He couldn't be sure, and it was unlikely that he'd have any answers anytime soon. Obi Wan changed quickly and silently left his room, throwing his heavy cloak over his shoulders and hoping that he'd manage to get through the temple undetected. It was a long way from his quarters to the library, but if he was lucky, Obi Wan Kenobi. The Padawan froze, groaning softly as the light female voice stopped him, her soft footsteps approaching him. He turned, his eyes downcast as he bowed. Master Luminara. How may I be of assistance? Many people have been looking for you this morning, Padawan. Already? She nodded. You are becoming quite popular. I saw your master earlier, he seemed concerned. He said he could not reach you through the force. Obi-Wan smiled softly and silently put his mental defenses in place. I was just sleeping. It was a long day. I understand. I said as much to him as well. I'll be certain to seek out Qui-Gon when I have a chance, he said softly, bowed, and turned to go, but Luminara's quick call of Kenobi, wait, stopped him. Yeez, I said many people. The Jedi Council was looking for you as well. He held his breath for a moment, blue eyes wide, looking at her like he did not understand her words at all. Finally, he managed to squeak, what? Master Windu, more specifically, asked for you personally. He wished to see you in the council chamber when you were found. Which is now, I suppose. Why yes, Kenobi's mind was racing. How do I get out of this? His thoughts were chaotic and frantic. Did they know of his jealousy and his turmoil? Did they reconsider Qui-Gon's proposal in their stance on Anakin? Oh, no, I can walk with you, if you like. No, he bowed, keeping his eyes from hers in case those piercing eyes could see though him. I know the way. Thank you, Master Luminara. He turned and walked the opposite way from the library, his slow shuffle feeling like he was going toward his execution. Why was he so nervous? He had stood before the council so many times before, always felt comfortable around them, but now he felt as though he was being judged. He took deep calming breaths, reinforcing his mental defenses and preparing to what? Lie? He couldn't lie to them. The Jedi Masters would be able to sense if he was being dishonest. He would. Obi-Wan sighed, nervously twirling his braid. He didn't even know what they wanted. Maybe everything was fine. He just needed to be honest. He nodded to himself as he stepped into the elevator that would bring him to the council chamber, meditating quietly and calming himself, trying to find his balance in the force, but was unable to recenter himself. When the elevator stopped, he stepped out and, holding his breath, pushed the heavy doors open. Kenobi peeked inside, his heart beating a little faster and spotting Mace Windu, the Jedi Master calmly looking out the windows. Clearing his throat, he stepped into the room and bowed, quietly said, You called for me, Master? I did, Mace said strongly, not moving from his place, eyes focused on the distant skyline. We have a great deal to discuss. About Anakin? He ventured quietly, and the Master's mouth twitched into a slight smile. No, that matter is settled. Obi-Wan nearly sighed in relief, and that's when Mace looked at his dark eyes hard. Or maybe it isn't. The Padawan immediately tensed up again, and the Jedi Master had his answer. Your position with your master is not threatened, Kenobi. You will remain his Padawan until you are ready for the trials. Yes, I understand that. But you are unsatisfied still. Don't think your abrupt exit from the meeting yesterday went unnoticed, Padawan. Kenobi couldn't stop himself from grabbing his braid, pulling it nervously. I apologize, Master. I dislike watching Qui-Gon fight against the Council. Is that all? Obi-Wan finally looked up at Master Windu, his nervous blue eyes meeting the intense dark of the Master's. The truth, Kenobi. No, Master. I was offended. There was a great surge of emotion in here yesterday. Every one of us felt the Force sway under its weight. Could that have come from you? The hand at his side was visibly shaking. I'm certain some of it was, yes. Mace was silent for a long time, his cold eyes examining every feature of the Padawan, and Kenobi couldn't bring himself to look at him. Finally, the master nodded. Be mindful of your emotions, Kenobi. We seek to master them, not be ruled by them. You will never pass the trials when you take them if you cannot do that. Was that it? He finally looked at the master, blue eyes wide in disbelief as he saw the master lean back, a smirk upon his face. Was Master Windu messing with him? Obi Wan smiled cautiously. Master, are you enjoying making me terribly nervous? I always do, Padawan. Ah. He straightened, standing tall and relaxed. Well then, seeing as how I'm not being expelled from the order, could you fill me in on the council's decision regarding me and Qui-Gon? You will continue your training, and the boy will be kept as your master's ward. Obi-Wan frowned. So he can train him? No. He is forbidden to train him, but the situation is unusual. The boy has nowhere to go, and your master feels responsible. Obi-Wan nodded, face stern, but understanding. As for you, Padawan, you will accompany your master to continue to protect the queen. Mace smiled when Obi-Wan visibly cringed. It seems you'll be departing for Naboo very soon. The Senate has reached a decision on the matter. Oh, lovely. Yes, isn't it? Mace's face became grave. As important as all this is not why I summoned you here, Kenobi. The young Jedi looked at the master, eyebrow arched, uncertain of where this was going. Your master said you sensed this supposed Sith Lord long before you saw him. He does believe that, yes. Explain. The Force just felt disturbed. I sensed cold in the Force, I have never felt that before. And when I was close to the creature, it was overwhelming. Master Windu nodded. Master Yoda and I discussed this at length last night. He believes it is the dark side you are sensing, and if it is, we may in fact be dealing with an actual Sith Lord. He leaned forward, looking closely at the Padawan. When did you last feel this? Obi-Wan couldn't stop himself before he quietly said, I feel it now. This time, the Jedi Master looked alarmed. He got out of his chair and sternly commanded the apprentice to sit, and Obi-Wan sunk to the ground, legs crossed in front of him, hands tightly gripping his knees. Mace kneeled before him. Give me your hands. Obi-Wan was hesitant, but after a moment, he slowly took his hands off his knees, and the Jedi Master quickly grabbed them, his strong hands tightly gripping the Padawans. Master, what? Hush. Meditate with me, I need to see. Kenobi nodded, closed his eyes, and sunk into a meditative state. He felt the powerful presence of Master Windu around him, felt his mind pressing incessantly at his carefully crafted mental defenses, as if they were nothing, breaking through and delving into the young Jedi's mind. For a moment, he was worried about what the Master would see, but the power of the Force that Mace commanded strengthened young Kenobi. It was breathtaking to share in that power, and with a sigh, he lowered the last of his defenses, giving the Jedi Master full access to his mind. It didn't take long after that for Mace to gasp softly, his large hands tensing over the younger man's. I feel it. Obi-Wan opened his eyes to see Mace staring at him intently. It's faint, but it's there. You were right. There is a chill in the Force. Is that the dark side? Windu nodded. Be mindful, Obi-Wan. You will shortly be leaving for Naboo again, which is where you first felt this. I sense great danger. The Sith Lord? It's clouded, but I suspect so. The Master stood and helped Obi-Wan to his feet. I will consult Master Yoda on what you have shown me. Thank you for your cooperation, Kenobi. He bowed deeply. I thank you for your counsel, Master. Mace Windu laid his hand on the Padawan's shoulder. In time, you'll make a fine Jedi Knight. May the Force be with you, Obi-Wan. When Mace had said that Obi-Wan would be returning to Naboo soon, he didn't think it meant that afternoon. He found out when he got back to his room to find a message from Qui-Gon, demanding that he pack and head to the hangar immediately. With great irritation, the young Jedi threw a few things into his bag and left, his long strides carrying him to the hangar where the Queen's ship was docked. The library would have to wait. So much for there is no ignorance, there is knowledge, his education would have to wait. But when he returned, he would have a list of books that Jocasta knew would have to find for him. When he got to the hangar, Qui-Gon wasn't even there, and Obi-Wan couldn't help but feel even greater irritation with his master. He nearly turned on his heels to march himself straight to the library when he saw Padme walking with the ship's captain, listening intently as he talked. Before he knew what he was doing, he was taking long steps toward them. She smiled when she saw him approach. Obi-Wan. He bowed. Padme. I hear you and your master are coming with us to Naboo. Obi-Wan nodded. We are. The council is convinced the Queen is in danger, and they believe our paths crossing was no mistake. The will of the Force is that we see this through to its conclusion. Well, we are happy to have you along. She left the side of the captain and stood in front of the Jedi, bold as if she simply belonged everywhere she was, which struck Obi Wan as an unusual trait in a handmaiden. Do you have time to talk? Oh, always, he smiled softly, crossing his arms and pulling his cloak tighter around him. Did you hear about what happened with Anakin? Obi Wan rolled his eyes. I was there, so yes. Isn't it awful? No. Padme's face was first shocked, then indignant, and then simply confused. Why? The Jedi sighed. It's a bit difficult to explain, but training him was never an option. Qui-Gon seemed to forget that, then he took him away from Tatooine. But why? Well, the Jedi bit the inside of his cheek, twirled his braid as he thought. He's too old, he finally said, and Padme looked at him in disbelief, crossed her arms over her chest, her entire body language daring him to explain how a 9-year-old was too old for anything. See, Jedi aren't allowed to form attachments. That is the most difficult thing we do, for most, and to have a person adhere to it well, they must be taught from infancy. At 9, he has already formed attachments. To his home, to his friends, to his family, it's the natural thing to do. But for a Jedi, he shook his head. Attachments to others can lead us to emotions that will compromise our connection to the Force at best. At worst, well, many Jedi in the past have succumbed to darker emotions. Grief and anger can lead to the dark side, and well, those emotions don't happen if one remains unattached. She watched him intently, her intelligent brown eyes attentive and curious. So you don't have families? None outside the Jedi Order, no. And what if you lose a Jedi? Obi-Wan sighed and threw his braid over his shoulder. We have been raised to be unattached. Some are better at it than others. What about you? I'm struggling with the concept, as of late. He bit his lip and looked away from her, remembering the previous day in the council chamber, and how afraid he was to lose his master, how angry he was that he was being cast aside, how he felt the cold creep in as it was creeping in now. If he was truly unattached, the events of the previous day wouldn't have shaken him the way it had. It must be difficult to live like that. Yes. It is. So, do you not have relationships? She asked slyly, and Obi-Wan took a step back as she took a step toward him. Do Jedi have lovers? Kenobi wondered if he looked as flushed as he felt. And naturally not, though that was untrue. Qui-Gon was said to have had a woman he loved, and Obi-Wan had heard of several Jedi in the past who had left the Order for the affection of another. Even he had harbored feeling for the Duchess Satine, and though it wasn't enough to keep him from his duty to the Order, he had been very close to the woman and probably would have left if only she had asked him to stay. Padme laughed lightly. That's too bad, isn't it? Kenobi nodded a bit absently, and she smiled brightly. I had no idea how hard it was to be a Jedi. I thought it was all laser swords and floating fruit around and stuff. Floating fruit around? Obi-Wan scoffed. The masters would say that's a gross misuse of the Force to use its power for something so mundane and pointless. So do you do it? Occasionally. She smiled at him, and the two of them erupted in laughter that only stopped when they were breathless, tears gathered in the corner of their eyes. But it is all laser swords then? Obi-Wan shook his head, breathing deeply to stretch his aching stomach. No, it's more floating fruit than laser swords. We are all trained in the art of combat, but the Force is our focus. I mean, Master Yoda is probably one of the greatest Jedi that ever lived, and he never uses his lightsaber. She nodded, understanding in her eyes that seemed to still be laughing. I understand. Thank you, Obi-Wan. I understand you much better now, I think. Do you? I do. She tilted her head, regarded him in a way that indicated that despite her understanding, he was still a curiosity to her. I'd like to learn more about the Force from you. I would be happy to teach you what I know. He smiled shyly. But next time, you can tell me about your involvement in the politics here. She laughed. I'm not really involved, I'm just a handmaiden. Obi-Wan smirked. Are you? She inhaled sharply and flushed a light pink, and Kenobi felt her heart rate accelerate as he turned from her to board the ship. He stopped suddenly when he saw his master walking across the hangar, Anakin trotting along at his heels. Seeing his Padawan, Qui-Gon lengthened his stride to meet him as Anakin ran past Obi-Wan to Padme, his young face bright and overjoyed to see her. Kenobi sensed a deep connection between the two when the boy reached her and took her hand. Where have you been? Qui-Gon asked as he reached his apprentice, and the two walked away from the earshot of the boy and the handmaiden. In my room. Your door was locked. I was sleeping. Naked. The Jedi flushed, from embarrassment or anger, Obi-Wan was uncertain. His mental defenses were up and they were not coming back down. I reached out to you through the Force, but you were blocked off to me. I was fine, Qui-Gon. You have never blocked me out before. Criffing heck, I was asleep. And it's not like our day was easy. I needed to be alone, as I'm sure you can understand. The master was still suspicious, but he let the matter drop. I see you're bringing Anakin, Obi Wan said bitterly before he could stop himself. He is my ward and my responsibility, I can't leave him here. Obi Wan felt his temper begin to flare again. The child has no business on Naboo, not when we're headed into real danger. He should be left here, where you won't drain him. He can't be a Jedi, he is dangerous. And you are disrespectful, the master spat, and Obi-Wan felt his temper rise as Qui-Gon's did. It isn't disrespect, it's the truth. From your point of view, perhaps. The Jedi's face was hard with anger, but Obi-Wan couldn't stop. The boy is dangerous. They all sense it, why can't you? His fate is clouded, yes, but he is not dangerous. The council will decide Anakin's future, and that should be enough for you. He turned away from Obi-Wan before he could answer, dismissive and cold. Now get on board. He did as he was bid. He had no desire to talk further with Qui-Gon, not when the rift between them had grown so deep. Not when this particular fight was Obi-Wan's fault. He simply could not hold his tongue when he had felt so slighted and betrayed, but he was embarrassed with himself for causing further ill feelings when it was clear that Qui-Gon had come to him concerned. Nevertheless, the rift between them was large, real, and solving this would be no simple matter. Kenobi strode to the room on the ship that was designated his, threw his bag in the corner, and sat on the floor. He fully intended to meditate on what Master Windu had said. Putting his mental defenses up, Obi-Wan opened himself up to the Force in an attempt to balance himself again before he dove into contemplating the chill of the dark side that pulsed like a warning within him. The Queen had a plan. What that plan was, though, was lost on Obi-Wan. Everything was. He ignored all summons on the trip to Naboo, remaining in a deep state of meditation and lost within the embrace of the Force. He could not feel the tug of Qui-Gon's consciousness upon his own, did not hear the incessant knocking upon his door, but he did feel the Force and all its ebbing and flowing. As they came closer to Naboo, the Force became disturbed and turbulent like an Arctic sea in a storm. When the ship landed on the planet, the chill in the Force snapped to a freeze so intense, it hurt Obi-Wan to breathe, pulled him out of his meditation with such force that he was momentarily disoriented. He reached out and grabbed his heavy cloak, his hand shaking with the cold, and he pulled it around him like a blanket, trying to warm himself, but it did nothing. He didn't need to be a master to know what this meant. The Sith Lord was here, and he was close. Kenobi pushed himself to his feet, shrugging the cloak on and pulling the hood over his head. He had to tell Qui-Gon. When he came out of his room, the ship was empty. With a huff, he headed for the exit ramp and was hit with a wave of humidity as he left the ship. They had landed in the swamp. Obi-Wan frowned. What was the point of this? He looked around and saw the ship crew in a clearing up ahead talking to a group of Gungans, the aquatic people clearly standoffish, nearly hostile, and the Queen and her handmaidens attempting for peace. Kenobi caught sight of his master at the edge of the clearing, and he strode quickly to his side. He had hardly reached the Jedi when he quietly growled, "Your absence has been noted, Obi-Wan. Note it all you like." The Jedi glared, looking down at him and clearly displeased. "Is this your way of punishing me for defying the council? Do you think me a child, Qui-Gon?" He crossed his arms tightly, shivering into his cloak. "You certainly have been acting like one." He shrugged. "Maybe I have, but no, I wasn't spiting you, I was meditating." "That is a poor excuse. You always tell me to be mindful of the present, Qui-Gon, and I am. Right now. Being mindful of the present." Obi-Wan huffed. The antagonism between them wasn't making this easy. "There is a disturbance in the Force." "Of course there is, there's about to be a battle. It's freezing, Qui-Gon." It took the master a moment to really look at his apprentice, and after studying the boy, his hard eyes softened, and the irritation left him completely, his face suddenly concerned. "You're sure?" Obi-Wan glared at him, huddling further into his cloak, which should have been far too heavy for the hot, humid climate of Naboo's swamps. The master bowed his head for a moment before wrapping his arms tightly around his Padawan and holding him as close as he was able. Kenobi tensed for a moment before he shivered and relaxed against him, shaking with not just the cold. "I'm sorry, Obi-Wan. I shouldn't have been short with you. Master Windu talked to me about this before we left, and he sensed danger in this mission." He laid his forehead on his master's chest and could feel the slow, even beat of his heart. "The Sith Lord is here, I can feel it. We need to be cautious." "We will." He held his apprentice out at arm's length, carefully examining his face, reaching out with the force to touch his Padawan's mind, and Obi Wan let him in. Qui-Gon shuddered. Do you feel this all the time? Lately, yes. It's gotten worse since Tatooine, and landing here intensified it greatly. Qui-Gon nodded. Remain mindful of it, and tell me if it changes. We need to stand together on this matter if the Sith are involved. That won't be easy. The Master's face looked weary for a moment before he nodded and looked the young Jedi in the eye. Obi-Wan, about Anakin. Kenobi held his hand up, and the Master stopped. I will not discuss the boy, or what has happened over the past few days. There is a rift between us, Qui-Gon, and it's not going away. I will not drag that to the forefront when we need to be in tune with each other here. The Master nodded. I did not mislead the Council, Obi-Wan. The younger Jedi tensed, his face getting darker, and the Master grasped the Padawan's shoulder. Not about him, about you. You are ready for the trials. I have taught you all I can. You will be a great Jedi Knight, and you will make me proud. It was too much for Kenobi, and he had to bite his lip to keep from crying. He took a moment to catch his breath and calm his emotions. There were so many of them happening at once, and it was nearly too overwhelming for his little Jedi brain to take. Anger, joy, disappointment, pride, betrayal and gratitude flooded his entire being, and it was far too confusing to sort through the emotional surge. There is no emotion, there is peace. That was what I wanted to talk to you about, he confessed quietly. I don't think I'm ready, I'm conflicted and I need more time. Qui-Gon started to say something, but the conflict on his Padawan's face made him bite his tongue. When we return, you and I will sit down and discuss it, alright. That was enough. Obi-Wan smiled softly, looking at the ground and clutching his cloak tighter. Thank you. Qui-Gon smiled and pointed to the Queen and the Gungans. She wanted to land in the swamp. Yes, I was going to ask. If you were at the meeting, you'd know her plan. Obi-Wan gave his master a hard look, but he couldn't keep the smirk off his face. Haha. What's the plan? She's gathering an army of Gungans to help battle the Federation forces. Ah. Obi-Wan huffed. Qui-Gon? Yes, I really hate this. Obi-Wan stood alone in one of the many clearings by the ship, running a quick diagnostic of the vessel and maintaining on his own equipment. The Gungans had agreed to aid the Naboo in the fight, and they were now discussing the battle strategy. Obi-Wan excused himself from that particular discussion, which he saw as a waste of his time. Qui-Gon was there, and it seemed redundant to have two Jedi there when the Master would make the decisions anyway. Of course, the big thing to come out of the truce between the Naboo and the Gungans was Padme's revelation that she was, in fact, the Queen, and one of her handmaidens had been standing in as a decoy. What surprised Obi-Wan the most about this was how little he was actually surprised. It just seemed to make sense to him. With a deep breath, he activated his lightsaber, the glowing blue blade humming with energy and casting a faint blue glow around the area, the metallic ship reflecting the saber brilliantly. He sighed, feeling the blade in his hand and swung it gently, practicing his lightsaber forms, seamlessly flowing from one to another. There was a Sith Lord out there, and he'd need to be at his best. Obi-Wan disliked lightsaber combat, but he was told that he was quite good at it. He hoped it was true, or this fight would go very badly. Light applause made the man swiftly retract the blade and turn toward the noise, face flushed and feeling as though he had been caught doing something he shouldn't. I told you. It's all laser swords and fruit floating, Padme laughed. Obi-Wan put his hands in the air. You got me. Who am I to deny a queen? She smiled, creeping closer, but seemingly very uncertain of herself. Are you angry? I'm sorry I deceived you. I'm not angry. He shrugged. I suspected something was off. At that, she looked surprised. You did? How? The Queen was too uncertain, and you were far too strong. I didn't know what it was until today, but you Jedi are far too clever. Well, some of us are. She smiled at that, inching closer, more confident now that she knew the Jedi was not angry. What were you doing? Practicing. He tossed the lightsaber from hand to hand. Trying to balance myself. The Force I have been unbalanced lately. I need to correct this before the fight. You really think the Federation has a chance against the Jedi? I'm not an actual Jedi yet, not really, I'm still a Padawan, he huffed, plunking down into a seated position on the soft brown leaves. Padme quietly sat before him. There's something here, something dark. Is it that thing from the desert? Obi-Wan nodded, and the young Queen's face became grim. What will we do? We will do nothing, he is no concern of yours. He is Sith, and that makes him the concern of Qui-Gon and I. He smiled. Don't worry, we'll keep you safe. And you'll be using that? She lightly touched the lightsaber in his hand. Obi-Wan nodded. I wouldn't if I didn't have to, but well, it's going to come down to that. They were silent for a long while, the Padawan quietly contemplating what it was he must do, and the Queen understanding how dangerous the fight would be for all of them. The silence was making her restless, and finally Pad managed to laugh softly. Well, what would you do? I mean, if you could fight the way you wanted to, I'd just tell him to leave. Obi-Wan smiled sadly as the girl began to laugh. What, I mean it. You can't just tell someone to go away. I could. You couldn't. It was a challenge now. His master always said he was headstrong. I can. With the Force. Her brown eyes lit up. You're trying to tell me that the Force can just make someone go away? Or anything I want? He smirked, eyes flashing mischievously as he leaned toward her. I have spent a great deal of time learning this mind trick. I can use the Force to compel someone to do something I want. It usually only works on the weak-willed, but if you insist with enough force, you can get even the highly intelligent and strong-willed to comply. Her mouth hung open in amazement, and she was silent for a long while before she said softly, "Show me." He smiled. I don't think my master would approve in the situation. Using it just because is not exactly the Jedi way. It's mostly used to avoid conflict. Oh please, you have to. I can't. Please. Obi-Wan, please. This time he looked at her intently, his hand waving subtly before him. You don't want to see my powers. She leaned back and relaxed, the excitement leaving her face and replaced with boredom. I don't want to see your powers. Silence fell between them, Obi-Wan smirking, his eyes watching her carefully, and after a moment, she gasped and reeled on him, grasping his arm excitedly. You just did it. He laughed as her tiny fist hit his chest. Ow, stop, you're too strong. Do all Jedi have this power? Well, in theory, yes, but not all practice it. I do. He shrugged. You're too strong-willed for the suggestion to last, though. That's a dangerous power in the wrong hands. It is. He looked down at the lightsaber in his hands and slowly looked to the girl that was pressed close to him. He felt the cold in the Force, it hadn't left her eased since they landed, but now he felt the chill in the back of his mind. It felt like apprehension? A warning, maybe. Padme. Obi-Wan. I feel this is the last time we will see each other. The young queen looked at him with wide brown eyes. Don't say that. We'll be fine, both of us. All of us. I pray you are right, he said softly, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Feeling his distance, Padme scooted closer to him to sit right beside the young Jedi, her little hands gripping his heavy cloak. They didn't say anything else. They didn't need to. Obi-Wan knew he was right, and he didn't need the Force to know that after this battle, everything would be different. In hindsight, while this was the best plan, it was still a bad plan. Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon crouched behind a sleek Naboo fighter with Padme and her guards, the Jedi effortlessly deflecting blaster bolts, form a seemingly endless army of battle droids. The droids were simple to dispatch of, but their numbers were becoming a problem. Kenobi deactivated his lightsaber, peeked out over the ship and extended his hand, willing the Force to push through the next battalion of mechanical soldiers coming through the hangar bay. The droids went sprawling, which gave the infiltration team a moment to regroup. This is not going well, Obi-Wan huffed, falling back against a ship next to his master. He felt dizzy. Despite his attempts to connect with the Force, the chill through it distracted him, dividing his attention and leaving him unbalanced. Worse, his master felt his disturbance. Focus, Obi-Wan, we cannot falter now. I'm trying, master, but I know, Obi-Wan. The master closed his eyes, drew from the Force, and pushed one of the starfighters into the hangar bay door, the new blockage keeping out the recovering droids. We need to get the Queen to the palace. Did you memorize the plans as I asked? The Padawan nodded, closing his eyes and breathing deep, then popping his head up over the ship and observing the hangar. Master, the bay doors will lead to a secondary hangar, which will branch off into various maintenance areas. But that door over there leads to a service elevator that will lead to the palace. Qui-Gon deactivated his saber as well. Is it safe? Safer than fighting through another hangar, certainly. The path is small, and it's unlikely to be patrolled by large forces. We might have a chance to sneak past the sentries that way and take the Viceroy by surprise. Qui-Gon's eyes drifted to a Naboo fighter on the far side of the hangar, his face filled with worry. Master. The Jedi's eyes snapped back to his Padawan. Anakin will be fine. If we are gone, the battle droids will have no cause to be here. That was enough for the master. With a nod, he and Obi-Wan vaulted over the ship and ran across the hangar, Padme and her guards in tow. They were nearly halfway to the access doors when Kenobi stopped in his tracks and dropped to the ground, clutching his chest and gasping for air. Qui-Gon skidded to a halt and ran back to his Padawan, kneeling beside him and placing a hand on his shoulder. The other combatants stopped as well, keeping behind the Jedi. "Master, hush, Obi Wan. He's here." Qui-Gon's eyes shot up and looked at the ship that was previously blocking the hangar door and watched as it was lifted into the air and torn to pieces. The destroyed ship was thrown at the Jedi, but the Master reached out with the Force and caught them, redirected the rubble away from them, and stood to face his enemy. He stood in the hangar door, making it clear that none would pass him. The cloaked and hooded figure that Qui-Gon had faced in the desert stood before him now, but this time he was without the heavy black robes of before, revealing a thin, strong, athletic body. On Tatooine, his face was a picture of calm rage, but here, now, the red face was contorted in fury that could barely be contained. In his presence, Qui-Gon could feel the cold fury through the Force, and he quickly put up his defenses, steeled his mind for the fight ahead. He held a hand out to his apprentice, and Obi-Wan grasped his hand tightly, rising to his feet. "Are you all right?" The Master asked as he shed his dark brown robe and smiled softly as his Padawan did the same. "Fine now, yes. Focus, Obi-Wan. We must be balanced if we are to win." The younger man nodded, resolute. "Your Highness, when we're out you go through those door, as planned." Pad nodded, looking between the two Jedi and finally laying her hand upon Obi-Wan's arm. "Don't I," she whispered, and the Padawan just smiled sadly, advancing forward a few steps with his master to stand between the Sith and the Queen. The yellow eyes of the Sith Lord burned with the fires of the dark side, and as the Jedi advanced, a cruel smirk crossed his face. An old man and a man much too young stood before him, and the horned creature knew he could win. He extended his hand, his lightsaber clutched tightly in it and ignited the weapon, the blade extending long and crimson from one end, and then the ignition hissed a second time, a second blade extending from the other end. He laughed wickedly when both Jedi stopped in their tracks. The Master was the first to draw his weapon, the green blade humming to life. "Do not be intimidated, Obi-Wan," Qui-Gon said softly, slowly stepping forward. "Don't let this beast shake your resolve." "Yes, Master," Kenobi said softly, taking his own lightsaber in his hand and igniting it, blue blade blazing to life. "May the Force be with you, Obi-Wan. And also with you, Master." The two Jedi stepped forward to engage their foe. Qui-Gon lunged forward, and the Sith effortlessly parried his strike, giving Obi-Wan a split second to flip over the two combatants and flank the horned man, but he was ready for it, the other side of the double-bladed weapon blocking the Padawan's strike. The Dark Warrior retreated into the second hangar, the two Jedi in pursuit, and launching a vicious offensive against a Sith, but it was not enough. The tattooed creature was clearly trained for this purpose, and now that he stood facing not one, but two Jedi, he smiled wickedly as they fought, the blazing yellow eyes quickly observing and analyzing their every move. No strike was landing on the skilled foe, no parry or counter-strike could get past his incredible defenses. Obi-Wan could see that they were seriously outmatched. Maybe if he had been at his very best, they might have had a chance, but more likely than not, it would only have made the battle last slightly longer. He was unbalanced in the Force, and he could not refocus, the combination of the creeping chill in his first very real, very lethal battle, setting his heart racing and dividing his focus. At this rate, he would be the reason they lost this fight. His blue eyes narrowed as he swung down at his opponent, opening up to the Force, so that he and Qui-Gon could launch a coordinated attack. Those yellow eyes quickly flashed to Obi-Wan, and the Padawan suddenly found the adversary's black boot kicked into his chest, sending the apprentice flying back and leaving the Master to engage the foe alone. Kenobi grabbed his lightsaber as he jumped back to his feet and ran back into the fight. It was as if the Sith had sensed his intentions, which, in all likelihood, was exactly what happened. The Sith continued to retreat, fighting his way across this hangar and toward a large sealed door, which opened swiftly with a wave of his gloved hand, and the three fighters entered a power station, filled with generators and catwalks that extended far above and far below them. His master pressed hard, no doubt sensing the power of the Sith Lord and wanting to end the battle early, but it was clear that would not be happening. The battle had raged for some time, and their opponent had left no opening at all, despite the relentless attack, and the horned man seemed to just be getting started. The narrow catwalks gave the Sith an advantage, and he pressed the attack, driving the Jedi further into the power station. Qui-Gon attempted to get around him so that he and the Padawan could flank the double-bladed menace, but the creature was having none of it and managed to get Qui-Gon off his feet. Obi Wan was there to defend his master, keeping his blade close and defensive against a savage strikes as he covered Qui-Gon's recovery. The power station echoed with the sound of clashing lightsabers, the lights flashing as the blades clashed and sparked, and Kenobi began to understand that they weren't going to survive this. He was far inferior to his master, and he didn't want to think of how much better the Sith was. The wicked man was actively trying to separate them now, focusing on one while the other recovered, and then quickly dividing them again. He had a plan, and while it wasn't a good one, it was the best he had. If he was going to die, it would be giving Qui-Gon the opening he needed to slay the beast. Grasping his lightsaber tightly, he aggressively lunged at the Sith Lord, but the attack was anticipated, and the creature ducked under the blade, planted a free hand on the ground and kicked up at Kenobi, catching the Padawan under the chin and sending him flying over the edge of the rail. Obi-Wan fell past the lower catwalk, still recovering from the blow, but he managed to grab hold of the one below that one, pulling himself up with a grunt. Breathing heavily, he looked up at the catwalk above him and saw the Sith Lord fall down on it. Not landing on it gracefully, falling on it hard. Kenobi smirked as he saw his master land on the platform next to the dark creature, swinging down with his green saber and just missing as the fallen man rolled away. He had provided his master with an opening, just as he wanted. He could do it again. Thrusting his hand out, he called his lightsaber into his hand and ran to a circular platform where he could jump up to the next level and join the battle again. He made one opening, he could make another. Using the Force to augment him, he jumped up onto the catwalk above him in time to see his master and the Sith retreating down a long corridor, lightsabers flashing as green and red struck fast and hard. He took a deep breath and ran after them as fast as his legs could carry him. Qui-Gon looked worn and tired, but the Sith was on the defensive at last, and the master did not wish to waste the opportunity, relentlessly attacking the retreating man. Qui-Gon! Qui-Gon! Wait! Obi-Wan called after him, running as fast as he could, but it wasn't enough, and the Jedi master did not slow. The young Jedi had to come to a screeching halt as red energy walls suddenly turned on, segmenting the corridor and preventing him from moving on. With an outraged cry, Obi-Wan began to pace, looking through to see his master, and he sighed in relief. The wall was separating the Sith from the Jedi master as well. He watched Qui-Gon kneel, the Sith Lord pace, and Obi-Wan could do nothing. He was unbalanced still, the Force betraying him in its chill, and he was shaking with adrenaline and anticipation. The energy walls switched off, and Obi-Wan bolted forward, watching with intense focus as the Sith and Qui-Gon resumed their fight. Both parties re-energized from the brief break in the fighting, but it would be over soon. Kenobi could feel it. He just needed to give his master one more opening and the energy walls reactivated right before Obi-Wan could pass the last one, and he screamed in rage, activating his lightsaber and striking the red energy, the plasma blade rappelling off the wall in a shower of sparks. They were right there and he could do nothing, mere feet from the fight and unable to help. As he watched, it was clear that they were no closer to victory than they were at the beginning of the fight. Worse, they were closer to losing. Obi-Wan knew he could not defeat the Sith, and Qui-Gon was looking weary, his relentless attack slowing into a more defensive posture. He was trembling, tapping into the Force despite his unbalance, and was flooded with cold, making the hairs on his neck stand straight up. He couldn't help but reflect on the past few days and the whole mess that started this, the chill with him the whole time. It was too much to take, all the frustration, all the emotional turmoil that he couldn't help but feeling, the betrayal and confusion sending him careening off balance. The cold spiked, and in an instant, Obi-Wan's head cleared as he watched the Sith Lord fight. All his doubts cleared, all conflict gone in a flash, and replaced by a maddening, blinding rage. All the emotions he had been trying to repress had broken through his defenses, and his blue eyes focused in on the Sith Lord, and nothing else mattered. He wanted that malicious creature dead. The chill of the Force, so disconcerting before, suddenly felt comforting, a sharp contrast to the blazing fury that he felt within himself, and Kenobi suddenly recognized that while he had been sensing the dark side, the freeze in the Force, this cold was coming from deep within himself. He took a deep breath, exhaled, and let the darkness in. The Sith blocked a downward strike from Qui-Gon, sending the master off balance, and those yellow eyes snapped to the apprentice behind the barrier when the Force itself trembled. He stabbed backwards at the Jedi master and felt the saber pierce through the older man's body, but it had missed the critical strike, the blade cutting through his right side instead of fatal dead center. Qui-Gon went ridged with pain and dropped to his knees when the Sith removed the blade to pace away and come before the Padawan, his focus changing as his interest peaked, predatory and dangerous. Yellow eyes observed the young Jedi with cruel curiosity, his attention diverted from finishing the master off when the Sith felt the dark side surge around the younger man. Obi Wan watched his master fall, trembling hands clutching the burning hole in his side, his lightsaber on the ground next to him. Sharp blue eyes snapped to the Sith Lord, and they did not leave his smirking, cruel features for a second. The fury built within him, and for the first time in a week, Obi-Wan felt balanced, the Force once again his ally, even though his heart was filled with darkness. His focus was singular, nothing else mattered but the death of this creature. The Sith Lord felt the dark side surge, and he let out a deep, malicious laugh. He paced slowly before the Padawan, ignoring the pained groans of the master behind him and reveling in the rage of the trapped boy. The energy wall deactivated, and Kenobi was set loose. The Sith Lord was unprepared for the fury of the attack, as the Padawan's speed and power increased tenfold from what it was before. His lightsaber was blindingly fast, a blue blur that arched and spun and rained down blow after heavy blow on the twin sabers, and the horned man could do nothing but stagger back and defend himself, the young Jedi leaving no opening for attack. The Sith growled, finally regaining his focus and bringing his crimson blade down at blinding pace, only to be deftly blocked by the Jedi, the blue blade suddenly twisting and slicing up in a wicked slash that nearly struck the Sith Lord's face, connecting with the long handle of his red lightsaber instead, and severing it in two, one end flickering uselessly before it shut off. With a snarl, the horned man tossed the broken end to the side, grasping his now single blade in both hands as new fury raged through him. He rushed at Kenobi, but he was not fast enough, the Padawan ducking behind him and launching a new attack, his blue eyes never leaving the face of the Sith Lord and filled with silent, burning rage. They struggled against each other for a moment, both men on the offensive as reckless, killing blows met and were deflected away, only for the attacks to begin anew. For a moment, the battle raged, the intensity shaking the Force as the dark side fueled both combatants, their quick, reckless footwork, narrowly avoiding the open pit in the center of the room. While the Sith Lord was trained in the dark arts, the sudden and intense fury the Jedi Padawan was feeling was giving him an edge, blazing blade cutting lethal arcs in the air as he began blasting the Sith with the Force, the sheer intensity of it pushing the dark figure back and dangerously close to the pit. The Sith howled furiously, the Jedi rushing him swiftly, and the red blade arched toward the Padawan's head. Obi-Wan planted his foot right in front of the Sith, stopping suddenly and ducking under the red blade, catching his own saber in a backhanded grip as he spun, lashing out with the blue blade. Obi-Wan's piercing blue eyes locked with the Sith's yellow and watched as they went wide, shocked, as the Jedi's lightsaber bit through his body at the waist. He didn't look away for a moment, focus intense as the red saber dropped to the ground with a clang, and the dark-robed figure fell back into the chasm, his body bisecting as it fell. His hard, labored breathing quickly slowed to a shaking, shuddering pant, the rush of the Force silencing in his ears as Obi-Wan fell to the ground, dropping his lightsaber and shaking uncontrollably. He couldn't move for some time, his entire body numb from effort, his lungs burning with each breath. With a whimper, he managed to crawl to where his master lay, collapsing right next to the man, and, shaking, took his hand. Eyes closed, he reached into the Force and felt for Qui-Gon, found him in pain, badly wounded, but alive. Kenobi managed to smile through the weariness and the pain. Qui-Gon. The master trembled, breath hitching as his hand gripped Obi-Wan's tightly. I'm sorry. SHH. The Padawan scooted closer, laying his hand over the wound in his master's side, feeling the Force flow through him and to the injured Jedi. It's over. He felt the master. The next few days, everyone in the Jedi temple, from the younglings to the High Council, was asking the same question. What do you do with a Padawan that has slain a Sith Lord? Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon had been found by a rescue team sent by Padme, not long after the fateful duel had ended. The battle had been won, and the young queen took no time at all in making certain the people she cared for were safe. The council had been contacted, and by the time the rescue team had dragged the Jedi to the palace, a medical shuttle was ready to expedite them back to Coruscant. The two Jedi were both laid out on beds in the medbay, both of them flitting in and out of consciousness as they were treated. A nervous Anakin Skywalker spent his time on the ship fretting over the badly wounded Qui-Gon and looking in awe at the 4 lightsabers that were collected at the scene. News traveled faster than the ship, and by the time Obi-Wan returned to the temple, he was already a legend. He exited the shuttle gripping the edge of the floating medical bed Qui-Gon was in, and within minutes he was set upon by GD Master Luminara, who wasted no time in wrapping her arms around him. "Are you alright?" she asked, blue eyes concerned, and the Padawan nodded. She started to lead him away, but his hand was closed tightly on Qui-Gon's bed. "Obi Wan, please, I'm not leaving him. He will be fine. There is nothing you can do for him right now." Kenobi was resolute and did not move. Luminara sighed. "Please, we need to get you somewhere private. The council wants to see you." "I don't want to see them." The master sighed, looking at the tired young man, and she stood closer to him. "They are already beginning to stare, Padawan." His blue eyes snapped up, looking around the hall, and sure enough, there were GD everywhere. A large group of curious younglings, small groups of initiates, his fellow Padawans, even knights and the odd master were all standing around, whispering excitedly and pointing at him. He could feel himself blush up to his ears, and Luminara's plan seemed like a great one. He reluctantly let go of Qui-Gon's stretcher and stumbled, the Morialan master catching him. "Are you hurt?" "No, just exhausted." She nodded and put his arm around her shoulder, and he grabbed her tightly, using her for balance as they went away from the prying eyes. They slowly made their way through the halls, Kenobi shuffling his feet and stumbling occasionally, the GD that they passed stopping and staring as they went. "They're certainly nosy. Can you blame them?" "I think so, yes." Luminara smiled, but said nothing. The surroundings were not terribly familiar to him. "This is not the way to the council chambers." "No, it's not." She came to a door, laid her hand on the console, and it hissed open. The master led him inside a large but sparse room and walked him to the bed, helping him sit down upon it. The Padawan looked confused, and she softly said, "My rooms, Kenobi." His eyebrow arched, and he smirked softly. "I do hope you're ready to deal with the scandal that's sure to come from this. Well, if you're clearly well enough to make a fool of yourself, perhaps you should be seeing the council after all." Obi Wan flopped onto the bed dramatically. "No, Master, I think I'm fading." Luminara chuckled softly and sat on the bed next to him. "Do you understand what you've done? Made an inappropriate sexual joke? You killed a Sith Lord, Obi Wan." "I know, I was there." She gripped his shoulder with a long-fingered hand. "Qui-Gon, a GD master, failed to kill him, and you, his Padawan, not only saved his life, but killed a Sith in single combat." She felt the young man tremble slightly. "You're the first GD to kill a Sith in over 1,000 years, Kenobi. That's why they're all looking at you. You've become famous in an instant. Word sure does travel fast. The Naboo officials sent us the security footage. The council has reviewed it several times. And you know how word spreads around you Padawans." Kenobi laughed at that. "We do like to gossip." He groaned and pushed himself up to a sitting position next to the master. "Will Qui-Gon be alright? He survived the trip." "I suspect so." Obi-Wan sighed softly, his shoulders slumping in complete exhaustion. "Really, Luminara, the council wants to see me, and you brought me to your room instead. If they're talking this much about what happened on Naboo, think how much they're going to talk about this. I somehow think a dead Sith Lord will overshadow their completely false romantic scenario." She stood and pulled the blankets up over him. "I want you to rest. I'll go talk to the council and tell them you are here. I don't want to see them." Luminara smiled softly. "You must, but I don't think it will be now. The council has much to discuss. They may be too busy for even you, Obi-Wan." "I hope so. I'll be back soon. Do try to rest, please. You need to replenish your energy." The master left the room, and as silence filled the room, weariness overwhelmed the Padawan. He was more drained than he had though, and his attempts to connect with the Force were wholly unsuccessful, the energy flowing from it a mere trickle, instead of the rich stream he usually felt. Alone with his thoughts at last, Obi-Wan finally had a chance to contemplate all that had happened. The fight with the Sith Lord was illuminating, and he finally understood what was happening. There is no ignorance, there is knowledge, after all, and Kenobi felt grounded and secure in his conclusions. He had been feeling the dark side, had been very sensitive to it, and his focus on the pulsating chill had only made him more attuned to it. But still, the dark side unbalanced him, weakened him, prevented his focus by dividing his attention between the task at hand and resisting the turbulent emotions within him. Then he fought the Sith, and in his desperation, he let the dark side in. Embracing the dark side balanced him and connected him to the Force in a way he didn't know was possible. His anger and rage gave him focus, much like calm and serenity gave him focus before. He didn't feel corrupted or wrong, he felt alive. Without surrendering to his emotions, he and Qui-Gon would both be dead. There was nothing to regret, power was available to him, and he reached out and took it, balanced within it, felt the force swell within him, and pulse with raw power. This did not comply with the code. Obi Wan ran his hand over his face, groaning softly. Luminara had seen the security footage, but she said nothing about the fight, not really. Did she not see what fueled that fight? The council must have seen it, sensed what was going on. He was going to be thrown out of the order for this. On the other hand, the Jedi in the temple were in awe of him, and Luminara said that the slaying of the Sith Lord had made him famous. Surely the attitude would be different if the Jedi Masters condemned him for the use of the dark side. Did the council not know? Was it at all possible that even the greatest Jedi in the order couldn't tell what had happened? Could they not see the difference between being lost in the dark side and lost in the light? Obi Wan needed to see the footage. It was beginning to appear that focus just looked like focus, no matter the origins. It was possible that the origin of the force driving the combatants could not be discerned over a video feed, and if it could, it was also possible that the overwhelming power of the dark side could cloud the council's ability to see where it was coming from. And if that was the case, it seemed likely to Obi Wan that the dark side wasn't what the Jedi said it was. The Jedi Council could be wrong. Kenobi felt relief wash over him, and as his body relaxed, he slipped into unconsciousness. It was early afternoon when Obi Wan awoke, the sun casting red shadows around Master Luminara's room. He breathed deeply, felt the force flow through him, and he smiled, sitting up with ease. His muscles were a bit sore, but he felt shockingly well rested, his connection with the force fully re-established. He closed his blue eyes and focused on his displeasure with his master, the anger at the situation with Anakin, and he felt the cold creep into his mind as the darkness swelled within him. With a small smirk, he banished the rage behind his tight defenses, and the dark abated. That connection was secure as well. He would have to explore this further at a later date. There is no ignorance, there is knowledge. There was a clean change of robes folded neatly at the foot of the bed, and it suddenly felt like forever since he was clean. He couldn't get out of his robes fast enough, the sweat and dirt of Naboo, and the fight with the Sith clinging to him and suddenly oppressive. He stripped out of them as quickly as he could on the way to the shower. He took his time, savoring the hot water as it took any remaining weariness out of him. He stood there long after he was done washing, letting the water run over him, as he felt that, finally, his mission was over. It was nearly an hour later that he emerged and dressed in the fresh robes, smiling at the softness of them. Comfort had not been a part of his life for quite some time, and Kenobi was going to dang well enjoy it while he could. And on that note, he was absolutely famished. Obi-Wan placed his hand on the console and the door slid open, and he ran right into Jedi Master Quinlan Vos, who seemed surprised for just a moment before his mouth curled up into a devious smirk. The Padawan openly rolled his eyes. "Kenobi. Master Quinlan. I was looking for Luminara." His brown eyes flashed mischievously. "Is she decent?" "No." Those brown eyes laughed. "TCH, that's too bad now, isn't it?" Obi-Wan crossed his arms. "What do you want?" "Well, I wanted to see Luminara, but quite frankly, you're far more interesting, Kenobi." The Padawan frowned. Quinlan Vos was famous in his own right among the Jedi Masters for two very specific things. The first was his gift in psychometry, an exceptionally rare force ability that allowed him to see the history of an object simply by touching it, a trait Obi-Wan greatly admired. The second was his reputation for bending rules, a trait that the Padawan had no patience for. It was this same trait in his own master that he disliked, but he respected Qui-Gon, despite the rift between them. He did not respect Quinlan Vos. How the renegade master managed to train a remarkable Padawan in the form of Isla Sakura, Obi-Wan would never know. "Look, I'm really hungry, so, of course you are. You've been out for 2 days." "What?" Quinlan shrugged, smirking at the young man's shock. "We did try to wake you, but the Force would have none of it and kept you. Criffing Sith hells. The council was looking for me the day I arrived from Coruscant." "I know." Vos laughed, clapping a large hand on the boy's shoulder. "They are so mad." Obi-Wan went tearing down the corridor, the master's laughter echoing after him. He pushed the hunger from his mind as he entered the elevator and punched the button, rapidly tapping his foot as he waited for the lift to take him to the council chamber. When the elevator stopped, he rushed out and, without announcing himself or knocking, he threw open the heavy doors of the High Council with the force and dashed into the room, breathing heavily as the eyes of all 12 masters turned to him. "Obi-Wan Kenobi," Mace Windu drawled, leaning back in his chair. "Did you sleep well?" "Yes, thank you, I had a lovely coma." He threw his braid over his shoulder and quickly bowed to the masters, and they silently acknowledged him. I apologize. I meant to come sooner, but Master Yoda held up a hand, and the Padawan was silenced. Much to discuss, we have, Obi Wan. Kenobi bowed his head. Yes, I imagine we do. His mental defenses were in place, all his fears hidden safely behind them. He hoped. First and foremost, Master Plo Koon said softly. Your Master Qui-Gon recovers. He hasn't come to yet, but he will be back to full health in time. That's a great relief. I'm glad to hear it. His blue eyes fell to the ground, looking intently at the intricate mosaic of the floor. I am eager to return to my training. The battle on Naboo illuminated my weaknesses. The Jedi Masters looked at one another, some of them whispering quietly, too softly for Kenobi to hear, and he observed them carefully, his suspicions rising. We were going to ask you about that, Mace started, leaning forward to look intently at the boy. But we have reviewed the security footage many times. And, he growled, despite our best efforts, there isn't a datapad in the entire temple that doesn't have a copy of the fight. Plo Koon's deep chuckle echoed in his respirator. We simply do not know what to do with you, Kenobi. So young, and already a legend. Obi-Wan looked up at the Masters, looked through the Force and found them pleased? Impressed? Proud? No, it was all these things. They didn't sense it. He could scarcely believe it. The Masters didn't know. I want to see. Difficult for you, it may be, Yoda cautioned, but Kenobi shook his head. No, I need to see. Please, Masters. The Jedi looked to Yoda, and he silently nodded, and Obi-Wan looked to one of the walls where the footage was projected. He watched the Sith's attention snap away from Qui-Gon in that critical moment, going to pace before the energy barrier, and when it flicked off, the Tempest was released, and Kenobi held his breath as he watched. It was breathtaking, the fight swift and ferocious, the young Jedi aggressive and athletic, the blue lightsaber a blur as it repeatedly struck at the Sith. He had been so worried before about what it looked like, given what had actually happened, but that fear was put to rest as he watched the image of himself ending the Sith menace. He thought the Masters would see the dark side fueling him, but all Obi-Wan saw in this was the focus of a Jedi. I didn't think I knew, but. The first Jedi to kill a Sith in over 1,000 years, Mace mused softly. You are a credit to the Jedi, Kenobi. Yoda stood, slowly shuffling to the middle of the chamber to stand before Obi-Wan. Confer on you the level of Jedi Knight, the Council does. Blue eyes shot to the diminutive Master, shock and fear gripping him. Excuse me? He looked around as the Masters stood, and he quickly shook his head. Me? Knight? What about the trials? Kenobi, you killed a Lord of the Sith, Mace said forcefully. Nothing in the trials will come even close to that. To do what you have done requires one to be so in tune with the Force, only a true Jedi Knight could achieve it. I'm not ready. If you're not ready to be a knight, nobody is. He was afraid. He was exploring unknown territories of the Force, forbidden territories, and now he would have to do it alone. Who are you kidding, Kenobi, he chided himself. You were always going to do this alone. Qui-Gon doesn't stand behind you. He kneeled, bowing his head. Masters, thank you. I will not let you down. Yoda laid a hand on Kenobi's head and cut his braid, putting it in the new knight's hand, and Obi-Wan smiled softly. This was what he wanted, after all. All his life, this was what he wanted. Now, as for what you will be doing next, Mace said, amused as he brought Kenobi a stack of papers. These are all the initiates that have written you begging to be taken as your Padawan. You have got to be kidding. Mace smirked. As I said, Kenobi. Every datapad. He flipped through the stack, quickly reading a few of the requests before he put the papers on the ground. This is insane. I can't teach anyone. You are a knight now, Obi-Wan. You will teach. I was just knighted. What makes anyone think I'm ready to have a Padawan? Well, that security footage has a lot of people convinced. Obi-Wan huffed and reached for his braid, only to remember that it was in his hand, cut from him. He'd have to develop a new nervous habit. Masters, I still have much to learn. I think rushing into taking on a Padawan is unwise. Hasty. I believe patience is necessary in this matter. Yoda nodded. Agree with you, I do, Obi-Wan. So much pain Qui-Gon would be spared, if not so fast he had run. More slowly, you must proceed. Obi-Wan bowed his head. I will, Master Yoda. What then will you do? The Ancient Master asked, and Kenobi knew just what to do. The man I killed was Sith, but there are always two, a master and an apprentice. That can't have been the Master. We need to seek out the other Sith Lord before more start cropping up. The Masters whispered their agreement. We have been discussing that as well, Mace said strongly, and the other Masters fell silent. We have gathered everything we know about all of this. Jocasta Nu has everything compiled in the library. I want this mission, Masters, Obi Wan said swiftly. I need to see this through. Please, let me find the Sith. You just got back from a mission, Obi Wan. And now I need another. He twisted his cut braid in his hand. Let me put what I know to good use. If I won't have a Padawan, staying here seems a waste when there is work to be done. The masters whispered among themselves for a time, and Obi-Wan shifted from foot to foot, his heart beating in excitement. He needed this. Chasing the Sith would be a good way to get away from Qui-Gon, who he still felt had cast him aside. Now that he was a knight, it seemed Anakin would get the training that Qui-Gon wanted to give him. The very thought made Obi-Wan seethe. He couldn't be here to see that, he couldn't. Agree with you, the council does, Yoda finally said, and Kenobi grinned broadly. Thank you, Masters. I will not let you down. All of our information is in the library, Mace said as he eased back into his chair. We'll send word that you're to have access to all of it. May the Force be with you, Obi-Wan Kenobi. The knight bowed and left the chamber, rode the elevator down in silence, and when he started toward the library, his chest puffed with pride. Him, a knight. It was all he ever wanted. He couldn't keep the grin off his face as he strode down the halls, a singular thought running through his head. I am definitely going to grow a beard. Kenobi sat in the library with a huge bowl of stew and a datapad, poring over the compiled information that the Jedi had collected. It wasn't much at all, unfortunately, but it was enough to have an idea of where to really start. He shoveled a spoonful of stew into his mouth, groaning appreciatively as 3 days' worth of hunger slowly began to fade. He was going to need more stew, though. He looked up from the bowl and the datapad as Quinlan Bose and his Padawan, Isla Sakura, entered the library and approached him. I heard you needed me, Padawan. Quinlan said loudly, laughter in his voice, and Isla gently touched his arm. Master, Obi-Wan is a knight now. You know that. Bose sighed. You're taking all the fun out of teasing him, Padawan. Apologies, Master. The Twi'lek pushed past her master to stand next to Kenobi. Congratulations, Obi-Wan. If anyone deserved to be knighted, it's you. You are next, I'm sure of it. I hope so. She said in her slight accent, laughter touching her voice. Will you be celebrating? No time, I'm afraid, Kenobi said as he held up the datapad and shoveled more stew into his mouth. You wouldn't go anyway, Padawan, Bose huffed, crossing his arms. No doubt Kenobi wouldn't invite me, and if I can't you can't go. We'd see about that. Anyway. He said swiftly, shoving his Padawan to the side. What did you need, Obi? The blue eyes narrowed. Don't call me Obi. Why? Don't like nicknames? Only my lovers call me that. Quinlan laughed loudly, drawing irritated looks from the other occupants of the library, and Isla looked down at the ground, flushing furiously and her leku twisting in obvious discomfort. If only that were true. We could be such good friends. Don't count on it, Kenobi said as he reached across the table and grabbed a large wooden box, his long fingers tracing the bronze lock. I heard you were called in on finding out about this Sith Lord. Bose nodded. Yeah. They had me look at the lightsabers that were used in the duel. I couldn't really see anything, though. The dark side was clouding my ability to see. Well, that's a relief. Can you try again? He opened the latch on the box, revealing the recovered sabers, Obi-Wan's, Qui-Gon's, and the bisected Sith Lords. Bo's eyes narrowed. There's a lot of bad energy around those. The last time wasn't pleasant for me. Then I'll thank you twice. Quinlan groaned, rolled his eyes and laid his hand on the edge of the box. Which one first, boss? Obi-Wan picked up the functioning half of the Sith Lord's blade and held it out to Bose. We're not going to waste our time with the Jedi sabers. We need to know about the Sith, we won't learn anything from those. And Obi-Wan didn't want Bose touching his again. If his vision was clearer today, he might feel the rage that fueled him, his powerful tether to the dark side, and that couldn't be getting out. Oh, good. Last time, I could feel the pain of getting stabbed. Not exactly my favorite thing. He held his hand out, and Obi-Wan put the saber in the master's hand, and Bose closed his eyes. Kenobi watched him closely, observing his face twitch and tense as visions and memories flooded from the weapon into his mind. With a gasp, the master's eyes shot open, and he dropped the weapon back into the knight's hand. Better than the other day, but it's still so clouded. The dark side is obscuring everything. Did you get nothing? Bose shook his head. I got his name. Maul, he was called. Darth Maul. Maul. Obi-Wan grinned. That was much better than he had been expecting. Thank you, Quinlan. You have been a great help. Have I? The master purred. I suppose you should invite me to your celebration, Obi. I suppose I should, yes, Obi Wan said smoothly, placing the lightsaber back in the box and closing it. I'll have it tonight. Quinlan grinned. I'll be there. But I won't. The knight patted the tattooed cheek. Lots of work to do. You're a cruel son of a bench, Kenobi. The master called, his Padawan laughing hysterically at his expense as Obi-Wan left the library, datapad in hand and the box tucked under his arm. The name did help, but it wasn't enough. He needed to talk to Ajen Kohler, a Zabrak Jedi Knight who was just a few years older than Obi-Wan. He could have gone to the council, one of the masters there was a Zabrak as well, but Kenobi found it much easier to freely discuss things with his peers. Besides, the council clearly didn't know anything in regards to the Sith, or there would have been more in the report. He stopped by his new quarters and deposited the box on his desk, taking out his own lightsaber and clipping it onto his belt. Gripping his datapad, he headed out for the Room of 1,000 Fountains, a peaceful haven at the base of the temple, dedicated to quiet meditation and reflection, and a great deal of the knights could be found there when they weren't away on missions. Obi-Wan found the Zabrak Jedi at the base of one of the numerous waterfalls in the garden, dark eyes scanning the pages of a book in his hands. Ajen. The Zabrak's eyes shot up, softened as they found the fellow knight. Obi-Wan. Congratulations on your knighthood. Word certainly travels fast. You know how we talk. And many of us assumed that knighting you was the only course of action after what you've done. Obi-Wan sat next to him, datapad in hand, and swiftly brought up the files he needed. What do you need me for? Ajen asked, watching Kenobi's swift fingers bring up a still of the security footage that focused on the Sith Lord. The council put me in charge of hunting down the Sith, and this is all I have to go on. Obi-Wan pointed at the image. He's a Zabrak. I should say so, yes. Kenobi nodded, cleared the image, and brought up the file on Iridonia, the Zabrak homeworld. Can you look this over and make sure all my information is correct? Ajen looked at the datapad, quickly reading the information on the screen, scrolling down to review the entirety of the document. He nodded when he reached the end of it. All your information is correct, yes. Perfect. Your assumption is not. Excuse me? You assume this Zabrak is Iridonian. Ajen brought up the still of the Sith Lord, looking at it carefully. That is barely a Zabrak. That is a knight brother. Obi-Wan smiled slowly. I am so glad I came to you. He cleared the datapad of the information on screen and brought up his notes. What's a knight brother? You were correct that my species hails from Iridonia. However, a very small tribe of Zabrak males live on the planet Dathomir. Kenobi nodded, jotting down the information. Is there a difference? How can you tell? I can tell, trust me. These Zabraks are half-breeds, born from unions with the natives of Dathomir, the Night Sisters. They are all dangerous, and they are all force-sensitive. All of them? Ajen nodded, and Kenobi wrote that down as well. Dathomir is a nexus of dark side energy. It's made its people very powerful. So if I'm going to seek out the Sith, I'll need to see these Dathomirians. The Zabrak shook his head. No, just the Night Brothers. Fortunately, they live separate from each other, so you shouldn't have any trouble. Obi-Wan scoffed. They segregate their men and women? Why? The males live subserviently to the females. They are really only kept around for breeding purposes. Occasionally, the Night Sisters will stop by the male encampments, take the fittest of the tribe, and leave. Obi-Wan smirked. Well, I'd say that would make the males docile, but I know that's not true. They are very dangerous, yes, but you'll have better luck talking to the Night Brothers than the females. If you do end up on Dathomir, Kenobi, I'd advise you to be cautious, and whatever you do, avoid the Night Sisters. They are all force-sensitive, yes, but the females are trained in the dark side. Kenobi nodded, finishing the last of his notes and tucking the datapad into his robe. You've been invaluable, Ajen. Thank you. The Zabrak stood with the other knight. Is that what is next for you? Hunting down the Sith? Obi-Wan nodded, and Ajen smirked. If you need further help, I would be happy to lend my assistance, Sith Slayer. Ha ha, you're very funny. What's your next step? Kenobi sighed. I'll put in my proposal to the council so I can get permission to go to Dathomir. In the meantime, though, I'll have to start researching the planet and any other planet that the Sith may be hiding on. You won't find anything in the archives, the Zabrak cautioned. The council has restricted the information relating to the Sith. I know, I've already checked, Kenobi drawled as he turned from his fellow knight. That's why I'm going to have a look at the data archives of the Galactic Senate. The Senate was nearly empty when Obi-Wan arrived mid-afternoon. After a quick look, he confirmed that the Jedi archives had no information on Dathomir, the Night Brothers, or the nature of the dark side that ruled the planet. The Jedi desire to keep away from the dark side of the Force seemed hypocritical to the Knight. After all, the Jedi Code demanded knowledge over ignorance, and the Jedi's own fear of the dark side was standing in the way of the code. Obi Wan wasn't afraid, though. If he was to continue to control the dark side that had crept into him, then he needed knowledge of it. After all, now that he knew it was there, he couldn't simply pretend it wasn't. Dam a river and before long, the torrent would break through. That wouldn't happen to him. He would master his emotions and master the dark side that sprang from them. He had come here once with Qui-Gon when he was a Padawan, but then, he was reporting to the Senate the state of the Mandalorian conflict. He didn't go to the archives then, but he headed there now, the few people present looking his way as he passed. When he arrived, he smiled warmly at the guards. "Good afternoon. The Jedi Council sent me for information that relates to my current mission." The guard looked at a datapad he held and waved the Knight in, Obi Wan bowing slightly as he passed. The archive was positively enormous. Combing through here was going to take forever. Obi Wan frowned, went over to one of the central consoles, and looked up all information that was stored on Dathomir, groaning loudly when he saw that there was far too much on the planet. Locating the relevant information within that mess would not be easy. He began downloading all the information to his datapad and left to wander the archive while the massive amount of data was copied. He was looking through a map of Republic space when a reserved, cautious voice called, "Oh, you're him." Obi-Wan ignored him, hoping he was talking to someone else, but when the two quiet footsteps approached him, the Jedi turned to look at the man. He was middle-aged, not terribly tall, and carried himself with great importance. "I saw you, Jedi. In the security footage from Naboo." Obi-Wan groaned. "Don't tell me the entire Republic has that now." "Not at all, but I had it all sent to my office. The events that happened there were vital to the peace of the Republic." When the Jedi arched his eyebrow, looking at the man like he was crazy, the senator extended his hand. "I apologize, I thought you would know me, Master Jedi. I'm Chancellor Palpatine." "Oh, yes, the new one." When the former Chancellor Valorum was voted out of office suddenly, Obi-Wan had been in a poor state. In hindsight, he knew that he was in the grip of the dark side, but at the time, the feelings of betrayal overwhelmed him to the point of being able to focus on nothing else. He took the Chancellor's hand. "I'm Obi-Wan Kenobi, I know. You're all the Jedi are talking about." He grasped the Knight's hand tightly with both of his. "Let me say, it was valiant how you slew that savage beast, and you sent a very strong message to the Trade Federation about their aggressions. Believe me, I didn't do it to make the Trade Federation cower. No matter the reason, that is the result." He let go of the Jedi's hand. "What are you looking for, Master Jedi? Perhaps I can help." Obi-Wan carefully observed this man, reaching out with the Force to sense his intentions, but he felt nothing but a desire to help a Jedi. "I am looking for information on Dathomir," he said slowly, watching surprise cross the Chancellor's face. "Dathomir? Why, I'm on a mission." The older man nodded. "Say no more, Master Jedi." He took out a datapad, his fingers running over it before he brought up a file on the planet. "Well, it's in the mid-rim, fairly close to Naboo, actually. It seems that it has not been a part of the Republic for a very long time. The notes say witches moved in and are ruling there. May I see that?" Palpatine nodded and handed the datapad to the Jedi, watching those intelligent blue eyes swiftly run over the information. "Where did you get this?" "All the information I found was spread out and random." "You have everything compiled?" "Yes, the archive's filing system doesn't agree with mine." "Do you have everything organized like this?" Palpatine nodded. "Yes, though my collection is not as extensive as the archive. Now that I am in charge, the archive is due for an overhaul." Obi-Wan's voice dropped, like he was telling a secret. "Do you have files on Malachor or Moraband?" Palpatine frowned, took his datapad back and quickly searched for the two planets. "I've never heard of those," he said, shaking his head. "I could get my aides on it, though. I'm certain we could find something." No, that's all right." Obi-Wan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It was just a stray thought of mine, think nothing of it." He knew, though, that one day, he'd have to come back here and look them up. Both planets were Sith worlds long ago, and if he were a Sith Lord, he'd make certain to visit the places most sacred to their order. After all, the Jedi did similar with Ilum, Lothal and Coruscant. If he was going to find the Sith Master, he'd have to go there. He smiled at the Chancellor. "Thank you. You have been a great help." "It was no trouble. I can come with you and transfer the information to your datapad, if you like." The Jedi nodded, and the two men walked slowly toward the center of the archive. "I have to ask," Palpatine said softly. How did you manage to overcome that beast? You saw the footage. Yes, but the fight seemed lost to me. You and the other GD were outmatched completely. Yes, and when he struck your friend down. Obi Wan could feel his temper rising, not at the man at his side, he was simply curious, but at the memory of what had happened on Naboo. The Sith was dead, but the memory of standing there, helpless, as Qui-Gon fought and lost was too much. His hand balled into a fist at his side, his eyes closed and his jaw clenched as he fought the building rage. I just focused. Oh. The Chancellor observed the GD carefully, eyes narrowing as emotion flitted across the young man's face that he was struggling to control. Yes, that was all. I got in tune with the Force. He sighed, sliding his defenses into place. The fight with the Sith affected him more than he thought. I can't explain it beyond that. Well, the Chancellor said softly as they approached a central console, and he picked up the GD's datapad. The GD are right to be proud of you. The Force must be very strong with you for you to overcome such a foe. Obi-Wan shifted uncomfortably. He needed to meditate on what happened against the Sith. He understood, yes, but he needed to really know. The Chancellor handed him the datapad. All the information on Dathomir has been transferred to you, Master GD. Obi-Wan smiled, putting his anger aside. It would need to be put in its place before he went to Dathomir if he was actually permitted to go. Thank you for your help, Chancellor. Please, let me know if there is anything else I can do to assist the GD Order. I will. Kenobi bowed, and his long strides carried him swiftly out of the archive, leaving Palpatine to watch the retreating GD, a cruel smirk on his face. The next few days saw Obi-Wan throwing himself into his training in preparation for what was to come. When he wasn't tuning up his lightsaber combat, reviewing the forms and adopting changes to his inexperienced style, he was drowning himself in the Force. Kenobi always took a liking to the GD mind trick, a Force skill that he was becoming exceptionally good at as a means of negotiating and avoiding combat. Even after the power surge he got from the dark side, he still had no desire to fight if he could avoid it. But Kenobi was curious, and that curiosity led to him experimenting with the dark side. It was slowly, at first, for fear of the other GD around him, sensing that something was wrong, but he quickly realized that none of the GD could feel it. The dark side was clouding their ability to sense it, and Obi-Wan realized that the real danger of the dark side wasn't its power, it was its ability to conceal itself, to hide in plain sight, just as he was doing around his GD brothers and sisters. Upon realizing this, Kenobi recklessly dove into the dark side, letting it fuel him, putting the weight of the darkness behind his use of the Force, and found his powers greatly increased. His mental defenses were greater, not just from his careful focus, but from the dark side, clouding his true intentions. His Force suggestion was far more effective as well, finding himself easily able to dominate even strong-minded people, if he so chose to. But more than that, his connection to the Force was greater than ever before, the steadfast focus of his GD training lending control to the dark power that coiled within him. The dark side wasn't disrupting his connection to the Force, as he was told it would, it strengthened it. Obi-Wan thought he would be impatient to leave for Dathomir, but he found waiting on the Council's decision relaxing. With the decision out of his hands, he had free time for much-needed practice, and he found his headstrong nature being curbed into one of methodical patience. Knighthood suited him, he decided, and even though he had dealings with the dark side, Kenobi was intent on becoming the best GD master he could be. When he got the summons from the Council, Obi-Wan was in the training room with Isla Sakura, the two GD practicing their lightsaber combat, the training sabers swinging swift and graceful. Several Padawans were gathered around to watch the Sith Slayer fight, and Master Shaak Ti had to push through the excited GD to get to the ring. "Are you enjoying yourself, Kenobi?" she asked sternly, and the Padawans watching the fight went silent, waiting to see if the Togruta master was about to lecture the knight, but Obi-Wan just smiled. "I always enjoy myself, Master." He effortlessly parried 3 vicious strikes from Sakura, who tried to take him when his attention was elsewhere, but Kenobi's focus never left her, and he brought the training saber around and connected with her neck. The Twi'lek glared at him. "You cheated." "I cheated? You attacked me when my back was turned." Isla growled, raising her saber again, and Obi-Wan smirked, swinging the saber behind his back and raising it over his shoulder, blade angled forward and 2 fingers of his other hand pointed at Sakura, smirking in anticipation. The two lunged at each other, but just before they clashed, the training blades went flying from their hands as they swung, hit nothing, and both tumbled to the floor. Shaak Ti held the training weapons, face stoic as the Padawans around them erupted in laughter. "The Council has summoned you, Kenobi. Come with me, you do not want to keep them waiting." Obi Wan nodded, leaping to his feet, brushing himself off and offering a hand to Isla, the Twi'lek accepting the help to be pulled to her feet. Next time, Sakura. I'll win next time. He flashed her a devious grin, and he followed the Togruta master from the training room. They were silent for a little while, and Kenobi reached out with the Force to gauge what the master was thinking, but Shaak Ti was unreadable. Kenobi huffed. He wasn't the only one that kept his defenses up. He was about to say something to break the silence, but the master beat him to it. Are you enjoying all this attention? Kenobi shook his head. Not exactly, no. Honestly, I was expecting to be out of here by now. I think some distance will do us all good. Maybe the frenzy will die down if I'm not around for them to focus on. This seemed to please the master, and she nodded, a small smile on her lips. I watched you fight for a little bit. Oh, Soresu is an odd choice for the boy whose ferocious offense killed a Sith. Well, it suits you. She smiled at him, and the Jedi looked away, could feel his ears burn. He did not like so much attention. Getting out of the temple would be a relief. They walked the rest of the way in a peaceful silence, and together entered the council chambers, the masters all seated and waiting for his arrival. Kenobi bowed when he stepped into the center of the room. You called, masters? The council has sanctioned your request to go to Dathomir, Mace drawled, hard eyes looking at the knight. We are sending Master Luminara with you. We believe she will be a great asset on your mission. Kenobi smiled at this. Thank the Force they were sending Luminara and not someone like Quinlan. He was going to need someone predictable when the very planet was soaked with the unpredictable dark side. Though, Quinlan wouldn't have been a bad choice either. Thank you, masters. I will not fail you. What do you know of Dathomir, Kenobi? You got my report, masters. Kenobi looked up at the Jedi, all of them observing him carefully, and he realized that he was being judged. He closed his eyes and calmed himself, clearing his mind. The Sith was a Zabrak, so I spoke to Ajen Kolar about it. I assumed that he was Iridonian, but Ajen said that the Sith was, without question, a Night Brother from Dathomir. What know you of the Night Brothers, Obi Wan? Yoda asked, and the young Jedi shook his head. Not much. As you know, the Jedi archives are sealed on the subject. I had to go to the Senate archives to find what I needed. Obi-Wan huffed. It wasn't much, though, and I feel like I'm going into this situation blind. What do you need to feel educated on the subject? Plo Koon asked, and Kenobi met his shielded eyes. I need to know the nature of the dark side on the planet. If I am going there, I cannot be unprepared. The masters whispered among themselves, and Obi-Wan nearly rolled his eyes. The request for knowledge shouldn't be controversial. Dathomir is a nexus of the dark side, Mace said after the other masters had settled. The people there are strong with it, but we have reason to believe that their relationship with the dark side is very different from the philosophy of the Sith. That was interesting. In what ways? We don't know. Don't be deceived, though, it is just as dangerous and corrupting as it always is. The dark side is seductive, and this is no different. Kenobi frowned. That wasn't what he needed to hear. I understand. Careful you must be, Obi-Wan, Yoda cautioned, the master's face grim. Strong in the dark side, Dathomir is. I will be, master. Be prepared for anything, Kenobi, Mace warned. This is a dangerous place you are going to. We would not send you if we didn't think you could handle it, but you must be vigilant. Exercise patience and caution. Your faith in me will not be misplaced. The little Grand Master nodded. May the Force be with you. And also with you, masters. The knight left once again, his heart beating in excitement. He'd be out in the field soon, and he couldn't wait. He had been patient and content the past few days, but now knowing he was cleared to go, he couldn't wait to get out. Dathomir would be an education, in both the re-emerging Sith and his own connection to the dark side. The council had said it themselves. The dark side practiced by the Night Sisters was different than what was practiced by the Sith. Sure, they insisted that the dark side is still just a dark side, but Kenobi didn't believe it. He had felt it, he knew what it could do, and he didn't feel like any less of a Jedi for it. He'd have to be careful in his practice of it with Luminara around, but like what happened at Naboo, it was possible that the dark side of Dathomir would be so oppressive, the origin of the power could not be sensed. Regardless, he would be off soon. He'd have to tie up loose ends before he left. He entered his room and quickly packed for the mission, throwing extra robes and his datapad into a bag. He looked to the wooden box on his desk and went to open it, looking at the lightsabers within. He laid his hand on one of the pieces of the Sith Lord's weapon, and before he could think otherwise, he threw the saber into his bag. Regardless of what happened, he was going to keep that weapon. His blue eyes darted to the other weapons in the box, and he picked one of them up, closing the box on the other piece of the Sith weapon. Qui-Gon's lightsaber was much heavier than Obi Wan's, built for the heavier attacks that the Jedi Master preferred. He couldn't help but think of his former master, and the old feelings of betrayal slowly crept back into him, and bitter anger gripped him. There was no repairing that relationship. Qui-Gon had doomed it when he was willing to throw 10 years of close friendship away for a boy he had only just met. Still, he couldn't help but wonder about his recovery, and at the very least, he should have his lightsaber back. Tightening his grip on the weapon in his hand, Obi Wan left his room for the infirmary. Kenobi didn't know what to expect when he got to the medical wing, but he wasn't expecting the old master to just be sitting there. But there he was, and Obi Wan almost left as soon as he saw him, nearly unable to stomach facing him. Instead he just stood there, torn between leaving as fast as he could and rushing to the master's side. It was Qui-Gon that made the choice for him when the old master looked up, gasping softly when he saw his apprentice. Obi Wan. Qui-Gon pulled himself out of bed, his legs shaking when they hit the floor, and Kenobi had to rush to the master's side to catch him before he fell. "You are an idiot," he snarled, getting the injured man back into the bed, pulling up a chair and sitting beside him. "I didn't know if I would see you again. I almost didn't come." Obi Wan looked down at the lightsaber in his grasp and held it out to its owner. "I thought you should have this back." Qui-Gon caught the lightsaber in the younger man's hands between his own. "Thank you. For everything." Obi Wan couldn't reply, just looked away from his former master and took his hands away, tightly clutching the hem of his robes. "I heard you're a knight now." Kenobi nodded. "The council believes that only a true knight could defeat a Sith. They may be right. They may be wrong." Qui-Gon looked at him sternly. "You? Doubting the council? Has the entire world gone mad? I think it has. You are ready, Obi-Wan." He gripped the young man's shoulder, and the knight tensed up. "You were ready a long time ago." Kenobi shook his head, knowing that if Qui-Gon had any idea about what was eating at his former Padawan, he wouldn't have thought that. "You get what you want now, right? You get to train Anakin. The council hasn't decided on that matter yet." Qui-Gon smiled. "I suspect they will get to it when they're done fawning over you." That made Obi-Wan feel significantly better, like it was justifying his importance over Anakin. His chest puffed in pride. "Well, I saw the footage the other day. Your assault was impressive. All right, enough." He bit his lip, but couldn't help but feel extremely proud. "That's all anyone is talking about. That's mostly true." The master smirked. "Master Plo Koon has been here to visit nearly every day, and all he can talk about is his new little protege." Qui-Gon rolled his eyes. "If I have to see one more picture of Ahsoka Tano, I may lose my mind. It's a great relief to hear that someone has a life outside of me." Qui-Gon smiled softly. "Will you take a Padawan?" Kenobi shook his head. "I don't think I'm ready for knighthood, so I'm certainly not ready to teach. I'm taking on a mission for the council. I'm going to hunt the Sith." The master was quiet for a moment, looking at the young knight before him, and he slowly nodded. "That is extremely dangerous." "I know. Do you know how long you will be gone?" Obi-Wan shook his head. "The council doesn't think it will take very long, but I'm not so sure. My investigation has given me a name and a place. I head for Dathomir as soon as tomorrow." "A name?" He was called Maul. Qui-Gon seemed to hold his breath, his hand unconsciously drifting to the wound in his side. "I found where he came from, so I should be able to trace him to his master. This Sith Lord needs to be found before more appear. I suppose there is nobody better for the job," Qui-Gon said softly. "Dathomir is said to be soaked with the dark side. Be mindful." "I don't fear the dark, Qui-Gon." "Even so. You are young, headstrong, and you haven't been a knight for long. You must be cautious. I don't want to lose you to the Sith." "Trust me, Qui-Gon," Kenobi sighed. "That isn't going to happen." The master's eyes looked at him for a long moment, and Obi-Wan felt his presence in the back of his mind. There was nothing to be seen, though all his feelings were safely hidden away. Qui-Gon nodded. "I believe you. Please come back safely, Obi-Wan." "I will." Kenobi stood and smiled softly at his former master. "Take care of yourself. The longer you're here, the more you need to listen to Master Plo talk about his favorite youngling. As good a motivation as any. Goodbye, Obi-Wan. May the Force be with you." Kenobi nodded, turning from the master and leaving the infirmary, and he couldn't shake the feeling that his time with Qui-Gon Jinn was over. The next day, Obi-Wan was sitting in the pilot seat of a Republic cruiser, Luminara Unduli sitting in the seat next to him, relaxed and smiling as she observed how easily flying came to the young Kenobi. You could have been a pilot, she said softly, and Obi Wan looked to her. Sorry, what? If you weren't a Jedi, I mean. You are quite skilled. Obi Wan smiled at his companion. I think that without the Force, I'd be average at best. Luminara laughed. When did you become so modest, Obi Wan? Qui-Gon's Padawan was always so headstrong and proud. I'm not Qui-Gon's Padawan anymore. No, you're not. She looked at him carefully, noticing the relaxed ease he had about him. The braid cut from his hair made him seem a bit older, and his cheeks had the faint traces of stubble upon them. The boy had transformed into a man since she saw him last. I spoke to Shakti last night. She briefed me on the mission and had a fair bit to say about you. It seems everyone has a great deal to say about me these days. Luminara smiled excitedly. Sith killer. They whisper it behind your back, they are in awe of you. All of them. And you? His blue eyes looked at her expectantly, and she couldn't help but smile. Part of him was still the Padawan she knew, so eager for approval. I am more impressed with what Shakti was telling me about your evolving lightsaber skills. I hear you have begun to focus on Ceresu. I approve. Obi Wan smiled softly and looked away from the master. Well, I'm not nearly as good as you. No, but you will be. I'm glad that despite your training by a highly aggressive master and your own vicious attack against a Sith, you are adopting a more defensive posture. It speaks well of the Jedi way if the Sith killer seeks to defend before attack. It may make us more in tune for the mission if it comes down to combat. I was talking to Quinlan about you before we left. He said you're the easiest Jedi he's ever worked with to fall into sync with. The master looked at him curiously, smiling mischievously. Since when do you willingly talk to Quinlan Bose? He scoffed. Quinlan's all right. Never tell him I said so. Your secret is safe with me. She leaned back, relaxing once again. When we hit the hyperspace route, you and I should get some practice in. I can teach you a bit of what I know. Kenobi smiled at her appreciatively. Luminara was a paragon of the Jedi Order. She wasn't on the council, but Obi-Wan suspected that she would be if a space opened up. She was everything that a Jedi should be, kind, honest, and in complete control of her emotions, and he couldn't help but be envious of that. Her control was unshakable, something that maybe he could have once aspired to, but now he knew that he'd be unable. What was it Master Yoda had always said? Once you start down a dark path, it will forever dominate your destiny. And he had, hadn't he? He embraced the darkness, willingly let it in, and he couldn't get enough. He had wanted to know more from the moment he knew what he had done. Maybe the Jedi were right after all. How do you do it? He asked softly, and he almost killed himself for not being able to hold his tongue. Do what? He sighed. He couldn't get out of this one. I'm pretty good at following the code, but that first one. Luminara laughed. That is the difficult one, yes. There is no emotion, there is peace. She sighed. We all struggle with that at some point. Even you? I used to, yes. She smiled. There were times when I was a Padawan when I was certain I would fail my trials. I was very attached to a fellow Padawan who was killed when her and her master were attacked by bounty hunters. My grief was difficult to overcome, but in the end, I had to learn to let go. Obi-Wan looked at her, his blue eyes understanding. I'm sorry, Luminara. She shook her head. I learned and grew from the experience, but I was certain I was breaking the code. I was so lost. In time, I learned that it is our time when the Force wills it. Emotion and attachment isn't wrong, but when the time comes, you must be ready to let go. Prepare for the jump. He flicked a few switches and pulled one of his control sticks, and the ship hummed, the pinpoint stars becoming white streaks as the black of space faded away into the white and blues of the hyperspace route. Could emotion exist within the Jedi code? Was it possible to feel anger and sadness and love, so long as the emotions didn't rule you, so long as you could let go of anger and loss? Was it possible that the dark and the light could coexist, and you? Obi-Wan snapped out of his reverie, looked to the master regarding him kindly. Have you broken the code? I have. More than once. I was on the Mandalore mission with Qui-Gon when it happened. I was working closely with him to protect the Duchess Satine. He left often to scout ahead, and I was left behind with her. He could be gone for days at a time, and we got very close. Did you love her? I do. He flushed. I did, I might still. I put those emotions away when I knew I must leave her, but he sighed, leaning back in the pilot's chair. I would have left the order for her if she just asked. What if she asked you now? The question was loaded, he knew, but he couldn't stop the rush of emotions, the flash of memories, their first kiss under a tree in the rain, the first time she laid herself out before him, and he took her, the first time for both of them. His emotional upheaval was not unnoticed by Luminara, and the master put her hand over his. "It's too late for us," he said softly, clutching her hand, rubbing the back of it with his thumb. "I am dedicated to the order now. Our paths are different." The master nodded. "You are a fine Jedi, Obi Wan." "I do try to be." She stood, pulling him to his feet. "Are you still up for sparring?" He smiled at that. "I am always up for that, my dear." The Dathomir system revolved around a giant red sun, casting crimson light over the entire planet that made it seem like it was soaked in blood. The council was not wrong about the danger. When the two Jedi stepped out of the ship, they were slammed by the cold and oppressive weight of the dark side. It only took Kenobi a moment to adjust, breathing deeply as he reached out to the Force and let the dark side in, his entire being settling into a dark balance as the chill gripped him. Luminara did not settle so easily, and the force of it sent her to her knees, clutching her chest and trying to catch her breath. She reminded Kenobi of himself when the Sith Lord appeared on Naboo. He grabbed her shoulders and pulled her up to her feet. "Come on, Luminara, focus. Defenses up, keep it at bay." "How are you doing this so easily?" "I've done this before," he said softly, smiling. "I was the same way when I faced the Sith. It's easier the second time." She nodded, breathing deeply, encompassing herself, leaning on Kenobi for support until her legs could hold her. "So, shall we get going? You alright?" "Yes, you were right. Defenses up, focus." "Got it." He nodded. "We are headed north. I saw the village when we were landing, which means they saw us come in. We need to be cautious." "I agree." Luminara stood behind the younger Jedi. "After you, Kenobi." He grinned devilishly and with long strides took off in the direction of the village, Luminara close behind him. The sky, like the ground, was a deep red stained by the system's sun, and to the Force sensitive, the blue and dark twisted vegetation was soaked in the dark side. Kenobi felt himself thriving in it. He felt strong, stronger than he ever had, like he could do anything, like he could make anyone do anything. It was intoxicating. The careful and reserved way of the Jedi had no place here. On Dathomir, only the strong thrive, and Obi Wan Kenobi was strong. They heard the Night Brothers before they saw their village, a deep guttural chanting and the sounds of heavy weapons clashing against each other, and bodies being thrown to the ground carrying through the thick air. Obi Wan and Luminara exchanged a quick glance before they carried on, side by side, up to the village. As they got closer, the noise stopped, and when they came to the entrance, the village looked abandoned. Obi-Wan's sharp blue eyes moved lazily over the huts and watchtowers. "Be on guard, Kenobi," Luminara said softly, and he nodded. "Let's not be hasty. I want to avoid fighting if we can." The master smiled gently at him. "I was just about to say the same thing." They were both grinning like idiots at each other when the Night Brothers appeared, quickly vaulting over walls from every side, brandishing weapons and surrounding the two Jedi. All of them were tall, thin, and gaunt, the harshness of their world reflected on their lithe bodies. Their tattooed bodies ranged in color from bright yellow to muted red, their heads crowned with vicious horns. Despite the obvious danger, Kenobi couldn't help but feel a bit disappointed. None of the creatures before him were anything like Maul, none of them the vibrant red, none of them the piercing yellow eyes. Could he have come from a different village? His pulse didn't even raise, he was bored. There was no danger for Obi-Wan here. He grinned at Luminara, turned so they stood back to back. "I don't think we'll have much trouble here." "You think?" "Because they don't seem like they're going to be very friendly." One of the Zabraks growled and lunged at the pair, Luminara's hand darting to her lightsaber, and Obi-Wan held his hand out before him, reaching through the Force to hold the assailant in midair. The other Night Brothers took a step back. Now, Kenobi drawled, effortlessly holding the young, struggling Zabrak off the ground. "Let's not be hasty, boys. We aren't here to fight." The Night Brothers growled and began to advance. "They aren't listening, Obi-Wan." "Not yet." He growled and tossed the Zabrak that he held to the side, and he reached out and grabbed another, Luminara putting out her hands and pushing back with the Force, sending a good number flying back, but it wasn't enough. The Night Brothers were strong, and they were resilient, and they just got up and kept coming. Obi-Wan looked around the group of them, every one of them holding maces or clubs or bladed weapons or spears, and it seemed like fighting would be the only option. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw something move up on one of the watchtowers, and the Jedi knew what he needed to do. Drawing his lightsaber, the deep thrum of energy sounding as he activated it, Kenobi flipped up onto the watchtower and grabbed the stray Night Brother, holding the long blade at his throat. "Back off," he commanded, and the rest of the tribe stopped, backed away from Luminara slowly. "We aren't here to fight you, so drop your weapons." None of the Zabraks moved. until his hostage nodded and the entire tribe did as the Jedi commanded. His instincts were correct. This man led the group. Kenobi deactivated the saber and clipped it back on his belt and leapt down to stand by Luminara. The leader climbed down as well, rubbing his neck as he stood before the Jedi. "I am Viscus," the orange-skinned Zabrak growled. "What are you doing here?" It was less of a question than a demand, and Obi Wan bristled. He could have killed him. He had no right to make demands. His eyes narrowed, but Luminara stepped between them. "I am Luminara Unduli, and this is Obi Wan Kenobi. We are Jedi Knights, and we have been sent here on a mission from the Jedi High Council. What do I care about your council?" Viscus snarled. "There is no place for you Jedi here." "Maybe not, but there is a place for us," Obi-Wan growled back. "We're looking for a man named Maul." That got the Zabrak's attention, not just Viscus, but the entire tribe, all of them whispering in hushed growls and snarls that could have been anything from disgust to awe. It was hard to tell. "Maul isn't here." "Maul hasn't been here for a long time." "But he was here?" Luminara asked quickly, and the Night Brother nodded. "Yes, he was one of us." "He was not one of us. He was many things, but above all else, he was a Night Brother." Obi-Wan rolled his eyes. "Criffing heck, stop speaking in riddles." "Was Maul here?" Viscus frowned, crossing his arms over his chest. "Do you know how things are here on Dathomir?" He shrugged. "More or less. I know you boys live under the thumb of powerful Force users called Night Sisters. They are not Force users, they are magic." "Right. Magic," he said mockingly, and Luminara hit his shoulder, glaring at him. "My fellow Jedi is impulsive, I apologize," she said softly, and Obi-Wan grinned. Strangely, so did Viscus. "You live under the thumb of a woman as well, it seems." "Oh, I do," Kenobi purred, leaning in toward his companion, and the Morialan master covered his face with her hand. "Please, continue," Luminara said softly, and the Zabrak nodded. "The Night Sisters come and take the strongest males away, and we never see them again. They return later to drop off young males after they are born. All but one." Obi-Wan looked up. "Maul. Maul, yes. The Night Sisters kept Maul, so strong in the Force was he. We saw him occasionally, but it was very rare. And then we didn't see him at all." Obi-Wan didn't need to hear the rest of the story to know what happened. He was taken by the Sith Lord, made into the Sith apprentice, and died on Naboo. One thing was clear. The Night Brothers didn't know anything. This trip was beginning to feel like a waste. Luminara nodded. "Thank you. You have been helpful." Viscus nodded. "I don't know what you're searching for, Jedi, but you won't find help here if you're after Maul." "We aren't after him," Luminara promised. "But we are after one that is responsible for putting him on the path that lead to his destruction." The Zabrak's green eyes widened. "What happened? Is Maul dead?" "I'm afraid so," Kenobi drawled slowly. He watched Viscus carefully as the tribe leader bit his lip, eyes darting back and forth. "I don't have the information you need," Viscus said swiftly, "but Maul has a brother." Kenobi's blue eyes snapped to the horned man and narrowed dangerously. His anger instantly hit a peak, and the dark side closed around him. If Maul had a brother, that creature would also be dangerous, could also be a Sith. There was only one option. He needed to die, Kenobi had to kill him. "Where?" "Come, I'll show you to him." Luminara followed the tribe leader, but Obi-Wan stayed rooted to the spot, closing his eyes and breathing deep. This place was dangerous for him, he could feel it. The power of the dark side was too strong, and the Jedi was not prepared for the overwhelming sensation of power that ran through him like a riptide. It made his heart race, his hands tremble in excitement, a blazing, burning sensation behind his eyes as his rage peaked, and his focus narrowed into something murderous. There is no emotion, there is peace. But there was emotion, wasn't there? So much of it, and Kenobi felt it so keenly. He shut his eyes tighter, willing the burning to cease, remembering what he and Luminara had discussed. Emotion was fine, so long as it could be let go. He could let it go, he could. He could feel the darkness ease up slightly, and Kenobi grabbed that feeling and held it tightly, slowly easing back into control. The darkness was still there, but now he felt that he was master of it. Now, his blue eyes shot open, stormy from the rush of emotions he just felt, and cold gripped him. Something's here. The red sky seemed darker, everything seemed hazy, and it took the Jedi a moment to realize that a green fog was rolling in. The Night Brothers went running, and panic gripped him. "Luminara!" He shouted, running after the Jedi Master, and he saw her lightsaber before he saw her. He drew his own weapon, activated it, and stood beside her. "I felt something," she said quietly. "Something here is strong in the dark side." "I felt it too." I can't sense where it's coming from. The Marialan looked around cautiously, eyes squinting through the fog. Our guide has left us, she said softly. I suppose there are only a few things that could repel the Night Brothers. Are you thinking the Night Sisters might be one of those things? She smiled. I am thinking exactly that. You know, we think so alike, you and I. Maybe I could spend a few more nights in your room. She smirked. Certainly. After I beat you senseless, I will be obligated to give you medical attention. You are so sweet. He arched his lightsaber in the air, and it deflected a projectile that was shot at them from the mist. He heard the whistling of another from the other direction, and he struck that one out of the air as well. After that, it was like deadly rain. Purple energy streaked through the air toward the Jedi, and they had to move at blinding speeds to avoid or deflect them. It became clear very quickly that they couldn't win this. Luminara, we need to split up. There's too much focused attention on the two of us, and if we stay here, we're going to die. I agree. Who's going first? I'll take the fight to them, you stay alive. Kenobi drew up his lightsaber and jumped into the mist, closing his eyes and trusting the Force to guide him. He felt them. Dozens of them. He arched the blue blade forward and it connected, a shrill scream piercing the air. He opened his eyes and saw it, a woman with gray skin and red, cloth armor, one of her arms severed at the shoulder. He quickly lunged forward, driving the blade through the screaming woman's chest, and she fell silent. At her feet was a bow, but it was unstrung, and the woman had no arrows on her body. Another purple bolt of energy zipped past him, and his eyes widened in understanding. It was an energy bow, shooting bolts of energy instead of arrows. But that wasn't possible. They are not Force users, they are magic. That was what Viscus had said, and Kenobi was starting to believe it. Just what kind of Force abilities did these witches have? His eyes narrowed. There was no time to think about this, he had a job to do. Closing his eyes and reaching again into the Force, he ran back into the fog to combat the Night Sisters. Without his eyes to fool him, he found the Night Sisters quickly, his speed, power and ruthlessness enhanced greatly by the dark side. His lightsaber cut through several of the witches, swiftly moving on to the next when one fell. It did not take long for the whistling of the energy arrows to cease, and Obi Wan opened his eyes, to fog receding to reveal the Night Brother village, littered with the bodies of the women he killed. Deactivating his saber, he clipped it back on his belt, breathing deep and running a hand through his hair. He could see the Night Brothers peeking out from behind walls and huts, their eyes glowing in the low light. What a mess, Kenobi mumbled as he looked about the village. He didn't feel regret for their deaths, but he was disappointed that it came to violence. Somehow, though, he always knew it would come to this. Luminara. They're gone. There was silence, just a sound of the Night Brothers coming out from hiding and examining the bodies of the witches, as if they couldn't believe they were dead. Luminara? Kenobi tried again, but there was no response. Closing his eyes, he reached out to her with the Force and couldn't feel her presence at all. Eyes shooting open, he went tearing through the village, the Force granting him unnatural speed as he searched for the Master. Luminara. Still nothing. For a moment, he felt her presence, skidded to a stop and saw nothing. He reached out with his hand, pulling at the feel of her through the Force, and Luminara's lightsaber flew into his hand. Then there was nothing. No, his grip on the saber was crushing, his entire form shaking as he suppressed the feelings of desperation and panic, but the rage could not be contained. It blazed within him, despite the chill, and the cold flames consumed him. What do we do? One of the Night Brothers asked softly, and a dismissed grunt was his answer. Luminara can't die, not for this, not for me. Not on my mission. She had to be fine. She had to be. His breath hitched as he trembled. Nothing else but Luminara mattered. Nothing. Not the mission, not his own safety, just her, only her. I told you, the Jedi have no business here, the Night Sisters want them dead. We should kill this one too. The Night Brothers slowly advanced, but Obi Wan didn't move, hardly noticed that the men behind him started moving toward him, slow and cautious in the wake of the fallen Night Sisters. The Jedi calmed as he felt the darkness rush through him, power pulsating within him and the cold saturating his mind. This wasn't like before when he fought Maul, this wasn't the blind, focused fury. This was cold, powerful, intoxicating, and Obi-Wan gasped softly as his entire body, the entire Force, was flooded with the dark side. This is what he wanted. This is what he needed. Luminara was fine. He would make certain of it. Kenobi spun around, his hand stretched out and grabbed the closest Night Brother through the Force around the neck and gripped hard, golden flames burning in his eyes. Where is she? The Zabrak clutched at his throat, clawing at the invisible hands that choked him. He couldn't speak. He couldn't breathe. Two other Knight brothers rushed the Jedi, trying to save their brother, but Kenobi clipped Luminara's lightsaber next to his own and reached out with his other hand, eyes narrowed dangerously. "Stop," he commanded, and the Zabraks froze in their place, those blazing eyes turned on them, and the warriors looked frightened. With the power of the Force behind him, Kenobi commanded the men to kneel, and they couldn't help but obey. The man in his grasp had stopped struggling. "Jedi, please." Obi-Wan's eyes shot to the cowering form of Viscus, his hands raised in surrender, head low and pleading. "Please, let him go." Kenobi dropped the man and reached his hand out to the village leader, the horned man gasping, eyes wide, as he felt the constriction around his neck. Obi-Wan smiled. "Where are the Night Sisters?" It wasn't a question, it was a command. "Let us go, please." The grip tightened. "Where are they?" He struggled for just a moment before his eyes went blank, the will sapped out of his being. "They have a temple in the ravine in the forest. You will take me to them. I will take you to them." Kenobi released him, and Viscus fell to the ground, gasping and coughing. The Knight brothers parted as he walked toward them. "I should warn you. If anything has happened to my friend, I will pay it back tenfold on you." One of the Zabraks stood, bravely growled, "The Night Sisters. The Night Sisters will be dead if it comes to that." Obi-Wan smiled as he turned to leave the village, Viscus in tow. "Pray it doesn't come to that, boys." The Knight brothers watched the knight leave with their leader, and they understood why the Jedi were so feared. "This is wrong." Obi-Wan sat in the pilot's seat of the cruiser, flying low over the red planet, but the Jedi's mind was elsewhere. At first it was nothing to him. Luminara was gone, and the only thing that mattered was finding her, and if the Knight brothers decided to stand in his way, they would regret it. The dark side coiled around him like a snake, and once in its clutches, it wouldn't let Kenobi go. And he didn't want it to. It felt good to make the Zabraks cower, to make them bend to his will. He had used Force suggestion before, but it had always been more of a redirect. This time, it was a command, the Force entering the mind of his target and crushing their will, their morals, their desire, and replacing the pieces with his own. But now that the edge of the moment had worn off, the dark side's grip relaxed, and Obi-Wan could feel the Jedi code creeping back into him. A small, incessant voice at the back of his mind that couldn't quite be drowned out by the oppressive darkness of Dathomir. This is wrong. And he knew it was. All of it was wrong. Letting the dark side in was a mistake, coming here was a mistake, letting the darkness fuel his power was a mistake. The Jedi were right. The dark side could not be controlled. It was seductive, just like they always said, and now that he had it, he wanted more. It felt so good to be so powerful, to feel the darkness roiling within him and stroking at his mind, his entire being warm with the promise of power. The dark side owns you. And it was true. Even now, when he knew how wrong it all felt, he wanted more, felt the pull within him drawing him back to the dark side. He needed it. He needed it. "You are a Jedi." He was, wasn't he? He was a Jedi, and his was the order of the truly strong. Not powerful, not like the dark side, but strong. Resolve, resistance, patience, steadfast dedication, all these things made him a Jedi, and Obi-Wan had these things. The dark side was in him, like a drug, and he had willingly invited it in. This was his new reality, he knew it, but he was a Jedi. He had patience and the control of a Jedi Knight that was tempered by being the constantly frustrated Padawan of Qui-Gon Jinn. He would control it. If anyone could, it was a Jedi, and Obi-Wan Kenobi was a true Jedi Knight. Maybe not now, maybe not today, but he had patience, and he would learn. There it is. He snapped out of his revere and looked at Viscus, his thin hand tightly gripping the armrest of the co-pilot's chair, standing behind it and refusing to sit down. He was afraid. He should be. Kenobi eased up on the controls, setting the ship down in a clearing not far from the temple where the Night Sisters resided. The forest was thick with dark blue trees, tall and twisted and warped by the dark side. The entire area felt off, wrong, as if the nature of the dark side here was different than the sort that Kenobi had grown used to. "You should stay here," Obi-Wan mumbled, and the Zabrak flinched, nodded, gripped the chair tighter. "The Night Sisters will kill you." "They will not. You might be able to use your Jedi tricks on us, but the Night Sisters won't be swayed by you. Believe me, I haven't used any Jedi tricks today." He got out of his chair, grabbed the backpack he packed for the mission and rummaged through it. "When you're dead, I'm going to steal your ship. You will do no such thing." Obi-Wan pulled out a lightsaber from his pack, observed it for a long moment, and clipped it on his belt opposite of his and Luminara's weapons. "More weapons won't help you, Jedi." Viscus snarled, glaring at Kenobi, but still frightened. "I suspect this one will." He stood up, sighing softly as he slid his mental defenses into place, trying to leash the dark side within him. Don't steal my ship. I'm going to bring Luminara back here, and she's going to need it to get back to Coruscant. Viscous scoffed. You talk like you won't be going with her. I'd like to. I hope to. Just sit tight. Kenobi left the ship, focusing against the dark side as he stepped into the woods and began the walk to the temple. The force shifted, felt different and foreign as he came upon the temple, massive statues of native Dathomirian women guarding the entrance. The entire area felt unsettling, like a forbidden power was laying in wait, and Obi Wan couldn't shake the feeling that this was a terrible idea. The dark side surrounded him, but he pushed it away, trapped it behind his defenses. He didn't want to lose himself in there. He came here a Jedi, and he lost Luminara when he was lost in the dark side, but he would leave here a Jedi Knight. A real one. Kenobi took a deep breath and stepped within the temple, and the light seemed to extinguish completely. He could see nothing. Even when he closed his eyes and reached out with the force, he could feel nothing. This place wasn't just blocking out the light, it was blocking the force. He inched forward slowly, and his eyes began to adjust to pools that seemed to glow with eerie green light. It wasn't enough to see well, and Obi-Wan nearly tripped over steps that appeared before him. With a growl, he took his lightsaber in his hand and ignited it, the humming blue light illuminating the area just enough to see the long flights of steps before him. He took the steps two at a time, his urgency for finding his friend making the Jedi focused, ignoring the Night Sisters observing him from the stone huts that lined the hill he was ascending. As he climbed higher, the temple became bathed in a ghostly green light, the thick hazy mist from the Night Brother village hanging low in the air and spilling down the steps from the top of the hill. As Obi-Wan climbed the final flight, he came upon a sinister altar at the top of the ancient subterranean hill. The mist came pouring from a glowing green pool that surrounded a stone altar, and Kenobi shivered, his blue eyes focusing through the mist on the green-skinned woman that lay on the black stone slab. Obi-Wan whimpered, his legs nearly giving out from under him. Luminara, he moved toward her, but something gripped him, freezing him in place, and he could barely breathe for the freeze in his lungs. Welcome, Jedi. The voice wasn't just a voice. He heard it, felt it through the force, even through his limited connection, could have sworn that it wasn't just one voice. And it shook him. With a groan, Kenobi dropped to his knees, gripping his head and trying to will the voice away, trying futilely to strengthen his defenses. He looked up when he felt the presence before him, and he trembled, unable to tell if it was in fear or in awe. She was white-skinned, dressed in elaborate red robes, the black markings on her face, making it look like a skull. She regarded him curiously, amusement in her cold, silver eyes. He tried to speak, but found he couldn't. Her power was oppressive. Instead, his blue eyes fell on Luminara's body, and he felt cold rage grip him. She laughed at him, the rich female tone mixing with the undercurrent of something much darker, more sinister. Do you worry for your friend, Jedi? Don't, she's alive. For now. He glared at her, jaw clenched and hand clutching tight around his lightsaber, his anger giving him the strength to rise to his feet. Don't mock me. Or, are you Jedi? She regarded him carefully. When you landed on my world, I had thought you were the Sith Lord, returned for a new apprentice. She smirked cruelly when the rage dropped from the knight's face. Don't be surprised, Jedi. I know what you seek. The Sith Lord. He shook his head. Not now, Luminara came first. That much should be obvious, Kenobi growled. My friend. Give her to me. She laughed again, the two tones of her voice mixing sinisterly and sending chills down Obi-Wan's spine. I need a Jedi, she purred. There was a moment when he thought he'd lash out at the witch, take his saber and strike her down. He held out the weapon, pointed it at her, and deactivated it. Take me. Those silver eyes narrowed at that, darting across Kenobi and taking in every detail. You don't even know why. I don't care. The witch grinned sinisterly, but Obi-Wan stood taller, glaring defiantly at the powerful woman. He couldn't beat her, he knew that. She was stronger by far. I could have sworn you were Sith, she growled. Self-sacrifice is not their way. She moved out of the way, not seeming to walk at all, but float, and indicated toward the altar. Go, Jedi. Take your friend. But, you are mine if you do. Obi-Wan didn't hesitate. He rushed forward and took Luminara's hand. She was freezing, but she was alive, groaning softly as Obi-Wan sat her up, strong hands supporting her back. He thought the witch would have been pleased, but he sensed she was more curious than anything. What have you done to her? Nothing you would disapprove of, Jedi, she drawled, endlessly amused by the mortals in her realm. I suppressed her consciousness. She is sleeping. Her mind is not used to the darkness. Not like you. Kenobi glared at her, looped an arm under her legs and picked her up, holding her close, as if he could warm her. He didn't say a word to the witch as he strode past her and started down the numerous flights of stairs. The Night Sister silently followed, floating after him. When the dying light of the forest outside the temple could be seen, the witch whispered in his ear, "Not so fast, Jidi. You are mine. I am no such thing until she is safe on my ship." That seemed to placate the witch, as she was silent the rest of the way, following him out of the temple and through the woods, green mist running low and hazy after them. He strode up the ship's ramp without hesitation, viscous pacing like a caged animal. "I told you," he snarled, green eyes angry. "I told you they would kill her. You can't hurt my people. She's not dead," he said softly as he carefully placed Luminara in the pilot's seat. The Night Brother opened his mouth to speak when the witch entered the ship, and the man let out a choked cry as he dropped to his knees, cowering. The witch laid her hand on Obi Wan's shoulder. "Jidi. I know." He laid Luminara's lightsaber on her lap, long fingers brushing her cheek, and he reeled on the Night Brother. "Listen up. When she wakes up, you have her bring you back to your village and tell her to get back to Coruscant. There's nothing here for us." "I will." Kenobi nodded, and the witch grabbed his shoulder again, this time her sharp nails digging into his shoulder, and the world seemed to lurch around him, his vision filling with green mist and then darkness. He felt as though his body was jumping to the hyperspace lanes, the tremendous pressure on his chest and the rush in his ears, making him instantly nauseous. And then it suddenly stopped, and he dropped to his hands and knees, coughing and trying not to retch. Slowly, his vision returned to him, the oppressive black fading to the pale green glow of the pool around the altar. He was back, but how? Obi Wan slowly climbed to his feet. His legs shook as he looked around and saw the witch standing next to the altar, her pale hand stroking the smooth surface. "Come," she purred, the dark growl of her voice sending chills up his spine, but he did as he was told, coming to stand opposite her and laying both hands on the cold black surface. "Why do you need Jidi?" he demanded, and the witch simply laughed. "You may find out soon enough." Her silver eyes narrowed. "I am Mother Talzin. The Night Sisters are mine. The Night Brothers are mine. The magic of Dathomir is mine as well." "Magic," Kenobi scoffed. "This planet is strong in the Force, specifically the dark side of it. I have no natural connection with the Force, young one. But I do have a connection with Dathomir, and it is from the planet I draw my magic." "Right, the Force." She laughed at this, her own tones and the darker undertone mixing eerily. "You know so little, Jidi. Are you so certain you know all the mysteries of this galaxy?" "No, but I know the Force when I see it. If it was simply the Force at work, the Sith Lord himself would not have come here to exchange dark secrets with me." Kenobi shut up, looked at the woman as best as he could in the low light. He tried again to reach out with the Force, but found it still blocked to him. This place could have been magic, as she said. He examined her skull-like features for a time, and then slowly reached out his hand. "Obi Wan, Kenobi." She took his hand, grinning. "We have much to discuss, Obi Wan Kenobi. I suspect you're right. How are you blocking the Force?" Talzin laughed deeply, and Obi Wan lurched forward, catching himself on the altar as a rush of air filled his lungs and his head cleared, his connection to the Force re-established. "The last time I had a trained Force wielder here, he abducted my son. You will forgive my caution." His blue eyes widened. "Maul." "Yes." Obi-Wan bit his lip as he looked at the woman. Even with the Force returned to him, he couldn't read her mind, see her thoughts, feel what she was feeling, anything. He could be in serious danger. "You didn't answer my question. How did you block the Force?" She waggled her fingers, smirking at the young man's confusion. "Magic, Jidi. Dathomir comes from the dark side, yes, but my powers do not. They are beyond your understanding." Kenobi nodded. "I'll accept that." He unclipped the lightsaber on his right arm and laid it on the altar. Talzin said she needed a Jidi. He didn't know why, not yet, but that decreased his chance of dying within the next few moments by 5%, he suspected. Grasping the hilt, he activated the weapon, and the blade extended with a deep thrum of energy, glowing red and eerie in the pale green mist. "This is Maul's lightsaber. I killed him." Kenobi couldn't help but smirk in satisfaction as he watched Talzin's face drop with shock, disbelief, and then rage, and he could feel the power gathering around her. He knew nothing of her magic, but he did know the Force, and in that moment, he felt the dark side roar to life. Talzin picked up the lightsaber, examining it carefully for a moment before swinging it at the Jedi, the blade stopping an inch from his neck. Kenobi did not flinch, just glared at her with proud blue eyes. You defeated my son? He nodded, and the witch hissed, eyes narrowing in anger. How? How could a GD vanquish a Sith Lord? My son is strong. You are nothing in comparison. He was strong in the dark side. Kenobi smirked, his soft features made cruel by the red glow of the lightsaber. But I am stronger. Talzin was silent for a long while, observing the young GD with interest. Finally, she retracted the blade and laid the hilt back on the altar. You are unusual for a GD. Perhaps you are what I needed. And what am I needed for? Why did you need a GD? To take down the Sith. That, he was not expecting. He drummed his long fingers on the altar. Tell me about this Sith Lord. He came to me to exchange dark side teachings, she said softly. Our communion was beneficial, and he said he would take me as his apprentice, that we would rule the galaxy together. Rule the galaxy? That wasn't good. Kenobi frowned, crossing his arms over his chest. What was he called? He did not say. Her face did not change, but Obi Wan knew she was lying, could feel her deception in the Force, and he couldn't help but feel that she didn't learn nearly as much from the Sith Lord as he did from her. A true practitioner of the dark side could hide a simple deception. And that wasn't it, he could feel something else. Had she lied earlier? He would need to keep his guard up, this woman was dangerous. Well, you obviously didn't become his apprentice, so what happened? He sensed a potential in my son, and he abducted him from me. Her face contorted with rage, and Kenobi knew she was telling the truth. He took my first son, and my boy became Sith as well. Darth Maul. The Sith led him down the path to his destruction, and I will have my revenge. I will destroy the Sith and retrieve my lost son. Talzin, Maul is dead. I'm sorry, but you can't get him back. Her silver eyes flashed dangerously, and Obi-Wan couldn't help but feel she was hiding something. What did she know that he didn't? His stomach twisted into knots, and in the back of his mind, he felt the chill creep in, knew that she had not made a mistake. Maul was dead. He was. Right? Don't underestimate me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. I do not lose. He nodded. So this is why you needed a GD? To exact revenge on the Sith? It is. He was getting a clearer picture, but there were so many pieces missing, and he knew he would not be getting them. You know, Talzin purred, when you first landed here, I could have sworn you were Sith. Her long-fingered pale hand stroked his cheek, holding his chin as she forced him to look in those pale eyes. So much darkness in you, young one. He grit his teeth. I am a GD. Yes, and you are filled with the dark side. She smirked, running her hand over his shoulder and down his chest. How do your GD even let you outside of the temple? Everything inside you is screaming for the darkness. I can control it. He nearly shouted, his heart speeding up as those long, sharp fingers scratched over his chest. The witch laughed. Come now, you are so far from the council. Show me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. Show me the dark side. I can't, I need to control it. And you will. I can teach you. Your GD aren't here, so what are you afraid of? Let go. And nothing seemed like a better idea to the GD. She was right. There were no GD here, and if he wanted it, well. With a deep breath, he let his defenses down, and he felt the darkness rush into him. It was overwhelming, and he needed to grip the altar for support, his knuckles turning white and his shoulders shaking as he moaned, the dark side filling him with power and passion and pleasure and rage. Talzin laughed deeply as Kenobi laid his forehead against a cool, black altar, his death grip on the stone slab keeping him up as his knees buckled out from under him. Let it in, Obi-Wan Kenobi, that's it, she put a pale hand on the man's back, and he tensed, shaking as the darkness wrapped around him, coaxed by the witch and moaning loudly as he let go completely. I know, GD, it's so difficult to deal with the passion of the dark side, especially when you have been trained to have no passions. As the darkness wrapped around him, he slowly eased into the feelings, his pulse slowing as he settled into the dark side. It was stronger here than ever before, his careful defenses blinding him to how powerful it was in the home of the Night Sisters. With a deep breath, he regained the strength in his legs and pushed himself slowly off the altar, the trembling in his body stopping as his mind accepted the darkness he had been fighting. He looked at Talzin, his eyes seeming to glow slightly in the dark with pale yellow fire. The witch laughed loudly. Look at you. A dark GD. Talzin smirked as the glowing eyes narrowed in the dark. Don't be angry. It's rare. Magnificent. You make it sound like the GD can use the dark side and still be GD. I've been told that the dark side always leads to the Sith. If that were true, there would be thousands of Sith, and you GD would be extinct. Talzin smirked. The GD fear the darkness and it makes them weak. There is control over the dark side, young one. Your masters will not teach you, but others can. The Sith do not become powerful by allowing the dark side to rule them. No, they master the dark side. The witch smiled dangerously. Is that what you want? Yes. He didn't even need to think about it. Deep within him, he knew this is what he wanted. Complete mastery of the dark side was the only thing he wanted. You are in luck then. She stroked his face, and the man just accepted it. Jedi make the best dark side practitioners. Your control and focus gives you the ability to tame it. Her voice lowered. I cannot teach you the dark side, but you could learn from the Sith. Go to their planets, find their holocrons, and use their power against them. It was so simple, he wasn't sure why he hadn't thought of it before. Of course he would learn the ways of the dark side from the holocrons. Nothing else made sense. Nothing else mattered. So are we working together to take down the Sith Lord? Talzin smirked. Oh yes, little Jedi. We shall. You defeated one Sith, so perhaps you are the one to destroy the other. Consider me your ally. Until my son's revenge must be paid to you. Obi Wan's eyes flashed, and he was just about to ask what she meant when the sound of the Night Sisters screaming could be heard through the temple. Talzin chuckled. It seems you are no longer mine, Obi Wan Kenobi. But we will meet again. And with that, Mother Talzin disappeared into the green mist, and Kenobi didn't know what to think. He closed his eyes, his mind swimming with rage and passion and darkness, as he slowly put up his defenses, leashing the dark side to his will and containing it. The Night Sisters continued to shout, and within a moment, Luminara Unduli, green lightsaber blazing, leapt up the hill. Obi-Wan. He turned and smiled at her. Saving me, Master? Just returning the favor. The Night Sisters slowly appeared, bows drawn and surrounding the two Jedi, and they stood back to back, Kenobi activating his own saber as he put Maul's weapon back on his belt. Unfortunately, we may have to fight our way out of this. Again. It is becoming a pattern, dear. You are nothing but trouble. What? Me. Sisters, the rich voice of Talzin cut through the air, and the Night Sisters stopped. Let them go. Nobody moved, the Jedi staring down the Night Sisters, and then Kenobi's blue blade retracted. Well? You heard her. The women backed off, the purple energy of their bows dissipating as they retreated into the darkness. As soon as they were gone, Obi-Wan took Luminara's hand. Quick, before they changed their minds. The two ran hand in hand down the flights of stairs and out of the temple, stopping only when they could see their ship through the trees in the forest. Both Jedi were panting and out of breath, their hands clutched tightly together. Are you alright? Luminara asked, breathless, and Obi-Wan kissed her hand, smiling as the woman flushed not just from the exertion. Fine now. What happened in there? I talked with their leader. She had a lot to say. Come on, I'll fill you in on the way back home. I am sick of this planet. They walked up the ramp of the ship, quietly talking and laughing, relieved to have survived their ordeal, when an outraged cry shocked them silent. You Jedi are crazy, Viscous snarled, hands tightly gripping both sides of the entrance to the cockpit. You just run off everywhere. Oh, criffing heck, I forgot about him. I did run off rather quickly, the Marialan said softly, a sheepish smile on her face. Well, what are you doing, hiding out on my ship? Obi-Wan said swiftly, irritation in his clipped accent as he pushed past the outraged Zabrak and settled into the pilot's seat, swift hands powering up the ship. Honestly, now we have to take you all the way back. I wish you would have spoken up sooner. The two Jedi had to listen to the furious sputtering of the indignant Night Brother all the way back to the village. Mace Windu sat with his eyes closed, his strong fingers massaging his temples. He was tired. The past few weeks haven't been easy with the discovery of a new generation of Sith. It sent a wave of upheaval through the temple as masters began discussing redesigning the teachings that the younglings, initiates and Padawans would learn. If the Sith were truly back, war was not far behind. What was worse, all this madness culminated with a Jedi master leaving the order, becoming one of the newly counted Lost 20. And now, he had to listen to the trusted Luminara support the claims of the upstart Sith killer. Let me get this straight, Mace said quietly. Your dark side witches want to help kill the Sith master. Their leader is Darth Maul's mother, so yes. The Sith Lord took her son, Luminara said firmly, crossing her arms, Obi-Wan silent by her side. The dark side seeks revenge, and the Night Sisters are no different. And this Talzin? You said she met with the Sith Lord. How could she not know his name? Luminara looked to Obi-Wan, and the young knight stood taller. She was obviously concealing information. The dark side is, by its nature, deceptive. I don't expect her to be different. And you expect us to trust this creature? Master Windu snapped, voice raising in disbelief. I said nothing about trust, Masters, Kenobi said softly. She is not to be trusted at all. But I do believe she stands against a Sith, and I can't help but feel that a dark side ally is still an ally. The council began to talk loudly among themselves, the feelings in the room ranging from shock to outraged, and words like fool, traitor, and fallen were being thrown around. Luminara grabbed Obi Wan's hand and squeezed it reassuringly. The room silenced when Master Yoda tapped his stick upon the ground. What say you, Luminara? I agree with Obi Wan, she said swiftly. His instincts have been right since the beginning. He sensed a Sith Lord long before he saw him. His search led him to Dathomir, and now he's on the trail of a Sith Master. I didn't speak to this Talzin, but he did, and if she was truly an enemy, we would be dead. Maybe she's using us. I have no doubt that she is, but if she's willing to do that and let GD live, we may gain as much from this relationship as she does. This seems unnecessarily dangerous, Mace said wearily, and many of the Masters agreed with him. Mingling with the dark side is dangerous. So is doing nothing, Kenobi snapped, and the room fell silent, all 12 Masters watching him carefully. Masters, the Sith are back. Maybe you haven't accepted it yet, but I have. How many more GD need to leave the order like Master Dooku before you take steps to stop them? Mace glared at the young knight. We did act, Obi-Wan. We sent you and it wasn't enough. It isn't enough. We all need to be working on this. We can't just react when they show up, we need to take active steps to stop this. We need to get the Sith Master before he finds a new apprentice, or this will never stop. The Masters were silent, and Kenobi could feel the force around him, the presence of the Masters uncertain, afraid, cautious and apprehensive of the future. They didn't know what to do. Obi-Wan closed his eyes, and he could almost see the rage burning in him. How could the GD High Council be this blind, this complacent? 1,000 years of peace has made them weak. He stood before them, the dark side alive within him, and they couldn't sense it. Only one thing could make any sense out of this, could explain why the most powerful GD alive could not sense the darkness raging in him. Something was blocking their ability to sense the dark side. Discuss this, the council will, Yoda said quietly, grasping his stick tightly, eyes closed and brow furrowed in concentration. Beyond our sight is something awry. Obi-Wan exhaled sharply. Masters, if you're not going to take action now, then let me. I'll continue the search while you debate the correct path. Mace sighed and closed his eyes. Fine, Obi-Wan, keep looking. I need permission to access the entirety of the archive. Master Windu groaned. As a knight, you already have access to. I need to get into the forbidden archives. Kenobi felt the force thrum in his ears, felt the weight of the Master's heavy gazes, all of them pushing against his mind with the force, but Obi-Wan's defenses stood strong. His face blank and impassive. There is nothing in there for you, Obi-Wan, Mace cautioned, leaning forward and looking at the man intently. I disagree. Kenobi crossed his arms and met Master Windu's gaze. How can we be expected to fight the dark side if we can't identify it? I need to learn more. We need to arm ourselves with knowledge if we're going to defend against the Sith. Dangerous knowledge of the dark side is, Obi-Wan, Yoda cautioned, but Kenobi shook his head. No. Ignorance of it is much more dangerous. If we stay ignorant of the dark side, Masters, we're going to lose everything. How can we fight an enemy we can't recognize? His blue eyes observed the Masters and saw the disapproval on their faces, and he had his answer. With a sigh, he hung his head, closed his eyes. There is no ignorance, there is knowledge. I pray you remember this when you make your decision. Many Masters feel similar, Obi-Wan, Master Plo Koon drawled, and Mace glared at him. Many wish to teach their Padawans to fight the dark side. Many have asked for you to teach them. It requires discussion, Master Windu hissed, and Plo Koon nodded in agreement. Permission, I will give you, Obi-Wan, Yoda said softly, and the other Masters looked swiftly to the tiny Master. But be cautious. Delve not too deep into the dark side. Kenobi nodded, and no Master said a word. When nobody spoke against a decision, Yoda nodded. May the Force be with you, Obi-Wan. Mace put his tired face in his hands. When the council reaches a decision, we'll let you know. Just don't do anything stupid. The two GD bowed and left the council chamber, walking in silence to the elevator. So, that went well, Obi-Wan said as the elevator closed behind them. Luminara chuckled. You are starting to sound a bit like Qui-Gon. She smirked as the young GD tensed. It's not bad. You are bucking against the council, though, which we should all expect. You come from a line of GD that are a bit unconventional. Dooku disagreed with the council often as well. I complied with them, but if we can't change our tactics, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. What if the Sith have evolved? We thought they have been gone for 1,000 years, but they may have just been in hiding. The Sith we are dealing with may no longer be the bold, brash warriors of the old Republic. If they have changed and we do not, we have already lost. I do agree with you, Obi Wan. She smiled. Maybe this is what the Order needs. Maybe. The elevator opened, and the two walked out into the hall, Jedi Knights and their Padawans milling about. Why do you suspect Dooku left? Luminara shrugged. Dooku has always been at odds with the Council, something your master seemed to pick up as well. The Council hasn't taken open steps against the Sith, and in the wake of what happened to his own student, I can't imagine he was pleased. After all, he and Qui-Gon are very close. I never met him. Qui-Gon spoke of him often, though. He sighed, looked around at all the Jedi walking around the halls, Padawans and initiates walking closely to their masters and teachers, and Obi-Wan couldn't help but feel a bit jealous. He knew what he needed to do, but he was still afraid of it. He missed having a master, missed the close connection to Qui-Gon that he had felt with him for so long, desperately wanted to have him to fall back on, but that door had closed when he was cast aside. Kenobi wondered if Qui-Gon was better, if he got permission to train Anakin. Rage gripped him so suddenly that he had no time to bury the feeling before Luminara's bright blue eyes darted to him, looking at him with concern as she sensed the emotional upheaval. Obi-Wan, she whispered, laying a hand on his arm. What is it? Kenobi bit his lip and shook his head. I'm alright. My master and I just left on poor terms. Her eyes softened. I heard about the boy he brought, yes. I had not considered your place in this. She moved closer to him, wrapped her arms around him and hugged him tightly, and Kenobi felt emotion well up inside him. Time will heal this if you allow it to, Obi-Wan. I'm here if you need me. You better be. If there weren't rumors about us before, you better believe there will be now, because everyone is staring. She held him tighter. That's all right. Let them. Kenobi chuckled softly, held her as well. With all the turbulence that surrounded him, he was lucky to have a friend like Luminara Unduli. Maybe she was right. Things might turn out all right, given enough time. He kissed her cheek as he let her go. What's next for you? Luminara shrugged. More missions, I suspect. I have been keeping an eye on a few initiates. I may be taking a Padawan soon. There is another Marialan in the group, and we traditionally teach our own. I'll have to see if she has potential. Kenobi nodded. A good plan. I take it you will continue your pursuit of the Sith. I will, yes. Master Yoda opened up the Forbidden Archive to me, so I'm going to take advantage of that. Lumina looked concerned for a moment and took his hand. I understand the need for knowledge, Obi-Wan. You made your case well. But don't get lost in the dark. You are troubled, I felt your anger. It could be dangerous for you if you dig too deep in that state. Kenobi smiled softly, closing his eyes and nodding. You're right. I'll meditate on these things before I go. That isn't enough. Talk to Qui-Gon, clear the air between you two. Resolve this matter so you can approach the dark side with a clear head. I will. It seemed like a good idea. He was reluctant, naturally, but Obi-Wan responded to reason, and Luminara was being nothing but reasonable. Thank you for everything, Master Luminara. I'm glad I was with you on Dathomir. I was as well. Be well, Obi-Wan. She let go of his hand and left down the hall, ignoring the staring Jedi as she went. Apprehension gripped Obi-Wan. He did not want to see Qui-Gon, though he couldn't figure out why he was so resistant. He felt the cold creep into his mind, but it wasn't the rage and power that came with the dark side, it was a warning. But Luminara made her case, and made it well. He had to see his former master. Taking a deep breath, Obi-Wan headed toward the infirmary. The healers had informed him that Qui-Gon had been released a few days ago, that he was still recovering, but was in no danger at all, though he had been confined to the temple for the remainder of his recovery. That gave Obi-Wan the distasteful task of searching for the renegade master, his restless nature certainly keeping Qui-Gon from staying in one place for long. It was hardly worth it to even find him at this point, but he did tell Luminara he would find his old master, and he didn't want to disappoint her. Just now, he was searching through the academy, the large floor of the temple that housed the younglings and initiates and the classrooms where they would complete their basic training. It was possible that Qui-Gon would spend his time teaching, since he could do little else, and since the master had fought with a Sith Lord, Kenobi thought it likely that other masters would wish for him to share what he had learned with the future Jedi. After all, Obi-Wan himself had been asked several times just that afternoon for exactly that. From lightsaber combat to detecting the dark side, masters and knights stopped him in the halls and asked him to teach the students. He declined, of course, but did promise to return at a later date when his mission was not so pressing. It was Qui-Gon that found Obi Wan, calling out to him from across the spacious room, and the knight turned to face the old master, walking toward him slowly and using a walking stick to support himself. "I'm relieved to see you have returned," Qui-Gon said softly when he reached his former student. "And I'm glad to see you up and about." Kenobi pointed to his walking stick. "You look like Master Yoda, but much taller and less green." Qui-Gon chuckled. "Much less wise, I assure you." "Oh, I know that. When did they let you out?" "The day you left." "Did you find anything on your mission?" "Why yes, I did. It was much more awkward than Obi-Wan thought it would be." His gut feeling the last time he saw Qui-Gon was right. His time with the Master was over. All that was left was the rift between them, and it wasn't just on his end. Through the Force, he felt that the Master felt exactly as he did, but instead of the betrayal that Kenobi felt, Qui-Gon felt guilt. "Are you here teaching?" No, I'm the Master," cleared his throat. "I'm waiting for Anakin." Kenobi's eyes flashed dangerously, but his defenses were up, and Qui-Gon didn't sense the betrayal and anger. He was caught off guard with Luminara. It would not happen again. "Oh. What for? He's on a fast track through the basic training." He, the Master, looked away. "The Council gave me permission to train him." "That was fast." Obi-Wan smiled, but there was malice behind it, and even those without Force sensitivity could see that. "Did the Council completely lose their minds while I was away?" "It was less than a week." "Obi-Wan, please. They said he was dangerous. Master Yoda said he was dangerous." "Does that mean nothing anymore?" "It does mean something, and I will be mindful of it." He held his head up higher. "I can train him to control his emotions. He will learn." "How?" Obi-Wan hissed, glaring at the Master. The spacious room was empty with classes in session, and the two Jedi stood on the far side of the room, tucked away into the shadows and out of sight, so caution was not at the forefront of his mind. "How do you expect to be able to train him to do that when you failed to do it with me?" "Obi-Wan, you are a model Jedi, have you seen what I have become?" His defenses were up, but Kenobi couldn't keep the anger back. It gripped him hard and wouldn't let go, but his Jedi training was keeping the dark side at bay, coiling and hissing within him, but ultimately controlled. Of course the Master didn't see. None of them did. "You are better than this. I trained you better than this." "Did you?" "I told you I wasn't ready. My training is not complete. I needed more time with you." "You didn't listen. The Council didn't listen. Why couldn't any of you see that? There was nothing more I could teach you." "I meant that. You could have taught me to control this." Kenobi staggered back, clutching his robe tightly over his heart. "I wasn't ready to deal with being thrown out." "Qui-Gon, you tossed me aside like I was nothing. And for what?" "A dangerous boy too old to train. His potential is greater than mine," Kenobi snarled. "We all know it. That isn't my doing, Obi-Wan." The Master growled, and Kenobi's blue eyes narrowed. "No, it isn't, but it is your doing that you brought him along to replace me." The knight stepped closer, blue eyes glinting dangerously. "Here's a thought for you, Qui-Gon. Maybe the dark side I was sensing didn't come from just a Sith Lord. Maybe what I was sensing was coming from Anakin. Jealousy doesn't suit you, Obi-Wan. You are talking about a child. I will hear no more of this." "No, I'm sure you won't. You have never heard any of what I had to say on the matter." The two men glared at each other, and Kenobi could feel the rift between them growing deeper. There was no going back, not anymore. Neither man moved or said anything, simply glaring at each other as they both reached out to the Force to read the other, only to be met with iron defenses on both sides. The classes let out, and the large hall was flooded with younglings and initiates and Padawans, and the Jedi Knight smiled bitterly. "I'm going. I don't want to be here when your little protege shows up." "That may be best." He was already concerned about being the cause of the rift between us. "Oh, how considerate. I hope you let him know it was your doing." Obi-Wan smiled, backing away from the Master. "Hopefully little Anakin will be a better student for you than I was." Kenobi bowed mockingly. "Goodbye, Qui-Gon." He didn't wait for the response, he just turned and left, his long stride carrying him quickly from the hall. It seemed like so long ago when he first had these feelings for his Master, and at the time, he had felt guilty, ashamed that he did not have more control, nearly sick with the chill in the Force. But no longer. Now he was more used to it, thrived on it. The anger pumped cold fury through him, and the frozen feel of the Force became a comfort, a temper on the boiling rage within him, a reminder to be controlled and patient in his seething emotions. The Jedi would have him believe that the things he was feeling, the sense of betrayal and loss, the anger at being replaced, was wrong, should be repressed and forgotten. But Obi Wan was right, he was tossed out like he was nothing by a Jedi. He respected Qui-Gon, loved him as a friend, a brother, a father, and saving him drove him to tap into the power of his rage. He was attached, that could not be denied, which is what made this hurt as much as it did. All of this was rejected by the Jedi, and he was supposed to strive to avoid all of this. What was he supposed to do then? These feelings were real, justified, and Obi-Wan would not be denied this, told he was wrong for being wrong. The dark side became a comfort. There was no guilt for feeling this way, no rules to keep him from confronting the wrongs done to him. The Jedi would have him bury his feelings, forget his anger, forgive his master, but he wouldn't, not when he was treated like he didn't matter. Kenobi bit the inside of his cheek, eyes narrowing as he strode through the temple to the library. He needed to begin his research, and with knowledge of the dark side would come the understanding he needed to control it, to keep it hidden from the Jedi, and to use it effectively against the Sith. Nothing would stand in his way.